In the lands stretching across Kashgar and the fertile regions of Semurechye, a powerful confederation of Turkic tribes emerged during the 9th and 10th centuries. This union was ruled by a dynasty known to later historians as the Karakhanids. The exact origins of this ruling house remain uncertain, as the sources provide conflicting accounts. Yet, it is most likely that the dynasty rose from among the Yagma or Chigal tribes, both of which played important roles in the political life of Central Asia during this period. From an early stage, the Karakhanids came into contact with the Samanid state to the west. These interactions were not always peaceful. As early as the 9th century, clashes occurred along the frontier where settled Iranian lands met the steppe world. The Samanids even pushed eastward for a time, capturing key frontier towns and attempting to secure them. One such place was Isfijab, a strategically important settlement that served not only as a defensive outpost, but also as a vibrant commercial centre. Trade between the sedentary populations of Transoxiana and the nomadic Turks flourished there. Merchants from cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand established their own caravanserais, and the town became a hub of economic exchange. Despite Samanid influence, however, Isfijab remained largely under the control of a local Turkic ruling family, bound to the Samanids only by loose obligations such as military support, symbolic tribute, and the acknowledgement of Samanid authority in coinage. Further south, another key city, Taraz, changed hands during this period. It had long been associated with Turkic rule, but in the late 9th century it was captured by the Samanids. The transformation of a church there into a mosque reflected both the political and religious shifts taking place across the region. Trade continued to thrive, and Taraz remained an important link between the Islamic world and the nomadic societies of the steppe. A major turning point came in the mid-10th century, when the Karakhanids themselves adopted Islam. This decision reshaped their identity and political direction. They began to use Muslim names and titles while still preserving elements of their older Turkic traditions. Their rulers carried titles such as Khan and Kagan, alongside honorifics drawn from Islamic culture. Animal symbolism remained an important feature of their naming practices, reflecting deep-rooted steppe traditions. Over time, they also adopted titles such as Sultan, signalling their integration into the broader Islamic political world. By the closing years of the 10th century, the Karakhanids launched a determined campaign to seize control of Transoxiana from the weakening Samanids. They understood that authority in the Islamic world was not only demonstrated on the battlefield, but also through the minting of coins. Issuing coinage in their own names became a clear declaration of power. The first major advances were led by Hassan Bughra Khan, who captured key regions one after another, including Isfijab, Fergana, Samarkand, and eventually Bukhara itself. His victories were marked by the striking of coins bearing his name, a powerful symbol of sovereignty. However, his success was short-lived. After falling ill, he died during his return journey east, and the Samanids briefly regained control of their capital. The struggle did not end there. Leadership passed to another branch of the Karakhanid family, and a new wave of campaigns followed. One of the most prominent figures of this phase was Nazir, who systematically expanded Karakhanid control. Within a few years, he captured Chach, Samarkand, and finally Bukhara once again. This time, the conquest was decisive. The Samanid state, already weakened by internal divisions, could not recover. The rapid success of the Karakhanids can be explained by two main factors. First, the Samanid state was deeply divided. Military commanders, administrators, and regional rulers were engaged in constant struggles for power. Many provinces had already become semi-independent, and new powers, such as the Ghaznavids, were emerging from within the Samanid system itself. This fragmentation made it impossible for the Samanids to mount a unified defense. Second, the Karakhanids were no longer outsiders in a religious sense. As Muslims, they were seen not as foreign invaders, but as alternative rulers. Many members of the elite, including military leaders and landowners, supported them, hoping to gain advantages under the new regime. The general population, meanwhile, showed little resistance, treating the change of rulers with indifference. Once in power, the Karakhanids rewarded their supporters generously. Former Samanid officials who switched allegiance were granted positions and territories. Local landowners also benefited, gaining greater recognition and privileges than they had enjoyed before. This policy helped stabilize Karakhanid rule in the newly conquered regions. During its early phase, the Karakhanid state displayed several distinctive features. There was a strong sense of dynastic unity, with a recognized head of the ruling family. At the same time, the state was divided into appanages, territories governed by different members of the dynasty. These divisions were fluid and often led to internal conflicts. Power was structured hierarchically, with titles reflecting rank within the family. Economic rights were also shared, with multiple rulers sometimes drawing income from the same region. The sons of one of the leading rulers each controlled their own territories, and some rose to become heads of the dynasty in turn. The capital during this period was located in Balasagun. Although the rulers often preferred to reside in nearby encampments, rather than within the city itself. This reflected the continued influence of nomadic traditions, which remained strong despite the adoption of Islam and the governance of settled lands. Kashgar, another major centre, was controlled by a different branch of the dynasty. There, rulers issued their own coinage and asserted their authority over eastern territories. Meanwhile, Nasser, the conqueror of Transoxiana, governed a vast and wealthy region that included major cities such as Samarkand and Bukhara. Although he formally recognized the authority of the dynastic head, in practice he ruled independently. After his death, his territories were divided, leading to further internal struggles. Rival claimants fought for control of key cities, and at times multiple rulers held the same high titles simultaneously. These conflicts weakened the unity of the state but did not destroy it. External challenges also shaped the history of the Karakhanids. They faced repeated conflicts with non-Muslim Turkic groups to the east and northeast. These campaigns were framed as religious struggles, and victories brought both prestige and material rewards. Reports of major victories spread widely, enhancing the reputation of the rulers involved. Relations with the Ghaznavids to the south were complex and often tense. Agreements were made to define boundaries, but these were not always respected. Some Karakhanid rulers sought to expand into Ghaznavid territory, while others preferred alliances. Internal divisions within the Karakhanid family further complicated these relations as different rulers pursued their own policies. One particularly influential figure emerged from within the dynasty after a period of captivity and escape. Gathering support, he launched a series of campaigns that allowed him to seize control of large parts of Transoxiana. His successes led to the establishment of a new political order. He adopted a higher title and made Samarkand his capital, effectively founding a separate western branch of the Karakhanid state. This marked a major turning point. The Karakhanid realm split into two distinct spheres, often referred to as Eastern and Western divisions. The eastern territories were centered on Kashgar and Balasagun, while the western lands focused on Transoxiana. The boundary between them was not fixed and shifted over time, especially in contested regions such as Fergana. The ruler who established the western state proved to be an exceptional leader. Rather than pursuing constant warfare, he focused on internal stability and economic development. His rule became known for maintaining order, protecting property, and ensuring the safety of trade routes. Stories circulated about his firm stance against crime, portraying him as a ruler who enforced justice with determination. Economic policy played a central role in his governance. He introduced reforms to stabilize currency circulation, ensuring that trade could function smoothly. Different types of coinage were used for different levels of economic activity, and their value was carefully regulated. When irregular or debased coins threatened stability, he took decisive action to remove them from circulation and replace them with more reliable currency. These measures strengthened the economy and increased state revenues. With greater financial resources, the ruler was able to invest in public works. He built institutions such as hospitals and schools, providing care for the sick and support for students. His successors continued this pattern, constructing caravanserais along major trade routes and restoring important religious buildings. These projects not only enhanced the prosperity of the state, but also demonstrated the integration of Turkic rulers into the cultural and social life of the settled population. At the same time, efforts were made to reduce the internal conflicts that had long plagued the dynasty. The system of dividing territories among family members was gradually limited, and the power of individual appanage holders was curtailed. Although a fully centralized state did not emerge, these reforms brought a greater degree of stability. The transformation of the Karakhanid world during this period is striking. A dynasty that had once been rooted in nomadic traditions adapted itself to the demands of ruling a settled, urban society. While elements of steppe culture remained, the influence of Islamic and Persian traditions became increasingly dominant. The cities of Transoxiana flourished under this synthesis, and the region continued to play a vital role in the economic and cultural life of the broader Islamic world. Even during the time of Ibrahim Tamgach Khan and his son Nasr Shams al-Mulk, it was already obvious that the Seljuks were looking toward Transoxiana with growing interest. Yet in those years they failed to secure any lasting breakthrough. In fact, Nasr briefly managed to seize Seljuk-held towns in northern Khorasan, though he could not hold them for long. The real shift came later, during the reign of Ahmad ibn Khidr. By then, the balance had changed. The Seljuks entered Samarkand with the support of the city's religious scholars, whose relations with the Karakhanid rulers had been tense for many years. With their help, the Seljuks gained control not only of Samarkand, but also of other territories belonging to the Western Khanate. Even the rulers of Kashgar accepted their supremacy. For roughly half a century, the Karakhanids lived under Seljuk dominance. That dependence, however, was not the same everywhere. In the east, Karakhanid submission did not last long. Early in the 12th century, eastern rulers even pushed into Transoxiana, and for a brief period occupied Termez on the Oxus, which had belonged to the Seljuk sphere. The western Karakhanids, by contrast, remained far more tightly tied to Seljuk power. The financial side of that dependency is not clear, but politically it was unmistakable. Seljuk rulers were able to decide who would sit on the throne in Samarkand. Their authority was visible even in coinage, where the names of Seljuk sultans sometimes appeared beside or above those of the Karakhanids. The message was clear. The rulers of Samarkand still wore the crown, but the power behind it often lay elsewhere. At the same time, internal tensions within the Western Khanate were becoming more serious. After first taking Ahmad ibn Khidr's throne, the Seljuks later restored him to power. But his rule was marked by a worsening struggle with the religious elite. The conflict between the Karakhanid court and the scholars of Islamic law and theology had deep roots, and under Ahmad it reached a breaking point. In the end, the religious establishment prevailed. Ahmad was accused of heresy, and in 1095 he was put to death. his fall was more than a dynastic tragedy. It revealed how much influence the religious classes had acquired, and how effectively they could join forces with military interests against the ruler and against the wider urban population. A few years later, in 1102, the Seljuks installed Muhammad Arslan Khan, a descendant of Ibrahim Tamgach Khan, on the throne of Samarkand. With Seljuk support, he overcame a rival claimant, and for nearly 3 decades, Transoxiana enjoyed a period of relative peace under his rule. Muhammad became especially known not for conquest, but for construction. He invested heavily in the rebuilding and embellishment of the cities under his control. In Bukhara, he restored the citadel walls and ordered the construction of a new outer wall around the entire city. He raised palaces both inside the citadel and in the urban area beyond it. He also maintained good relations with the religious establishment, and this allowed him to sponsor a wide range of religious buildings. On the outskirts of Bukhara, where an older palace complex had once stood, he established a ceremonial prayer ground. Within the city itself, he built an impressive mosque whose minaret still survives, and he repaired another older mosque as well. These works reveal a ruler who understood that prestige in Transoxiana did not rest only on military success. It also depended on urban beauty, religious patronage, and visible investment in public life. Toward the end of Muhammad's life, illness weakened his grip on power. He was struck by paralysis, and once again tension flared between the Karakhanid court and the religious elite. The Seljuks used the unrest as a reason to interfere more directly. Sultan Sanjar, the most powerful Seljuk ruler of his age, entered Samarkand in 1130 and began treating the Karakhanid throne as something he could rearrange at will. One ruler was set aside, another brought forward. The Karakhanid monarchy still existed, but its independence had become increasingly fragile. It was at this moment that a new force appeared from the east, the Kara Khitai. Their origins lay far beyond Transoxiana. They had once ruled a vast empire centered in northern China, but pressure from new nomadic enemies forced them westward. When they entered Central Asia, they first took over the lands of the eastern Karakhanids. Then, in 1137, they defeated the western Karakhanids, near Khujand. Even so, they did not at once occupy Transoxiana itself. Their ruler bore the title of Gur Khan, and his capital stood near Balasagun, far to the east. The decisive collision came in 1141 on the plain of Katwan north of Samarkand. There, the Kara Khitai met the Seljuk army in one of the great battles of the age. The Seljuks suffered a crushing defeat. Sultan Sanjar fled to Khorasan, and the Karakhanid ruler also escaped. After that, the Kara Khitai became masters of Transoxiana. Yet they did not try to erase the Karakhanid dynasty. Unlike Muslim conquerors, they were not especially concerned with symbolic forms of authority, such as having their names placed on local coinage. Instead, they were interested above all in tribute. The Karakhanids remained in place as subordinate rulers, while officials acting in their name collected revenue for the new overlords. This arrangement allowed the Kara Khitai to dominate the region without governing every city directly. Their rule, however, did not bring lasting peace. The steppe and frontier regions of Transoxiana were alive with movement. Turkic tribal groups such as the Karluks and others were increasingly active, and their presence brought constant instability. One western Karakhanid ruler, Ibrahim III, was killed by the Karluks, his body left on the steppe. His successor took revenge by killing the Karluk leader, but this did not end the problem. The Gur Khan then tried to resolve the matter in a different way. He ordered the Karluks to move toward Kashgar and take up agriculture, hoping both to stabilize the frontier and to strengthen his Karakhanid vassals in Transoxiana. Instead, the policy helped trigger further war. Fighting continued, and although one Karakhanid ruler named Ali ibn Hassan won a victory, it was not decisive. His brother Masud ibn Hassan came to power only after a long and exhausting struggle against pagan Turkic nomads. A conflict that badly damaged Transoxiana. At last, in 1160 or 1161, Masud won a major victory on the steppe near the famous Ribat-i-Malik, the great caravan stop on the road between Bukhara and Samarkand. That success brought him enormous prestige. He was praised extravagantly by men of letters, who celebrated him as the ruler who had saved the country from the violence of the nomads. Masud became one of the better-known Karakhanid rulers of the later period. Writers dedicated important works to him, and poets praised him in grand style. He restored the walls of Bukhara after they had been ruined, campaigned successfully in the south against the Karluks, and imposed order in places such as Nakshab, Kish, Chaganian, and Termez. He also dealt firmly with rebellion from within his own military ranks and carried out operations against the Oghuz, who had been ravaging Khorasan. His reign stands out as one of the last energetic attempts to preserve Karakhanid authority in a world that had become increasingly unstable. During the second half of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th, two important developments reshaped the Western Khanate. The first was dynastic. Lasting control of Samarkand passed into the hands of the Fergana branch of the Karakhanid family. The second concerned the status of Fergana itself. The rulers there became not only practically independent, but formally independent as well. In Uzgend, the chief city of the region, they struck coins in their own names without referring to the rulers of Samarkand as their overlords. This marked a serious weakening of the idea that the Western Khanate was a single political body. Even so, some sense of unity lingered in the language of titles. The rulers of Samarkand continued to use more exalted designations than their relatives in Fergana. While Samarkand was ruled by men such as Masud ibn Hassan and later his son Muhammad, both bearing the title Tamgach Khan, Fergana was governed by close kinsmen whose titles were somewhat lower in rank. But this hierarchy could shift. By the late 12th century, one of the Fergana princes, Ibrahim ibn Hussein, had taken Samarkand itself and adopted a more majestic title. He passed both the throne and that title to his son Uthman in the early 13th century. Another son ruled in Uzgend, with lesser status. The final Karakhanid ruler in Fergana also came from this same branch of the family. The dynasty was narrowing into a more regional and fragile form. At this stage, a far more dangerous power was rising in the west: the Khwarazm Shah Muhammad ibn Taqish. He inherited and extended the military successes of his father and turned his attention toward the Kara Kitai, who still dominated much of Central Asia. Like the Karakhanids, the rulers of Khwarazm had once been their tributaries. Muhammad's first instinct was not to destroy the Karakhanids, but to draw them into an alliance against the common enemy. Another danger also threatened the Kara Kitai from the east, where the Naiman leader Kushlug was emerging as a major force. These pressures combined to destabilize the whole region. In Bukhara, local conditions created the opportunity Muhammad needed. The city had effectively fallen under the domination of a powerful clerical family, whose wealth and authority had become oppressive. In 1207, a local uprising led by a man named Sanjar, the son of a shield seller, drove this religious elite from power and seized the city. Muhammad used the turmoil as a pretext to intervene. He captured Bukhara, suppressed the revolt, and at the same time broke the power of the clerical leaders. He spared the rebel leader himself, sending him away instead of executing him. Muhammad then rebuilt the citadel and city walls before withdrawing. His later dealings with the Karakhanids were shaped above all by the behavior of Uthman of Samarkand. Uthman tried repeatedly to balance between larger powers. At first, he allied himself with Muhammad. Later, he turned toward the Kara Kitai and even sought marriage into their ruling family, only to be rejected. Then he shifted back again, this time acknowledging Muhammad not as an equal ally but as overlord. This change was reflected in the coinage, where both rulers appeared, one as superior and the other as subordinate. Uthman had been forced to lower his claims. The Kara Kitai responded to his changing loyalties by taking Samarkand, though they spared the city from plunder. Yet they could not remain, because events farther east demanded their attention. Their ruler soon had to turn back, especially after serious reverses against Kuchlug and other opponents. Once more, Uthman submitted to Muhammad, and once again the relationship was marked in coinage. The year that followed brought major military and political change. Muhammad defeated an important Kara Kitai commander and captured him. This victory caused rejoicing across the Muslim world. His prestige rose sharply, and he now began pressing the Karakhanids more forcefully. He sent envoys demanding submission. Uthman had already accepted his authority, and the rulers of Fergana followed. In Uzgend, new coins were struck naming both the local Karakhanid ruler and Muhammad as overlord. Another minor ruler delayed too long and was stripped of his territories. This moment marked the beginning of Muhammad's shift from partnership to direct domination. Soon afterward, Muhammad gave his daughter in marriage to Uthman, and for a time Uthman lived in Khwarezm. When he later returned to Samarkand, he did so accompanied by a Khwarezmian official who was clearly meant to keep watch over him. Muhammad had good reason to be suspicious. Uthman was unhappy with his subordinate status, and the people of Samarkand resented the conduct of the Khwarezmian presence. Once again, Uthman turned toward the Kara Kitai. In response, the people of Samarkand massacred the Khwarezmians in the city. This sealed his fate. In 1212, Muhammad took Samarkand and showed no mercy. Uthman was executed, and envoys were again sent to the Karakhanid rulers of Fergana, demanding obedience. The last Karakhanid ruler in Fergana tried to delay the end by accepting vassal status and proving it through the issue of coins in two names. But this was only a short pause. Soon even that compromise ended. Coins began to appear naming only Muhammad ibn Tekish. The same happened in Samarkand and in other cities once ruled by the Karakhanids. The old dynasty disappeared from power step by step, city by city, until it was gone. At first, Muhammad hadn't intended to destroy the Karakhanids. He had wanted allies against the Kara Kitai, and he was willing to tolerate their prestige and titles. But once they became his vassals, the relationship changed. Their titles were reduced, their autonomy narrowed, and eventually their lands were absorbed. In the east, the branch of the dynasty collapsed amid the struggles involving the Kara Kitai, Kuchlug, and unrest in Kashgar. In the west, direct action by Muhammad ended their rule. The fall of the Karakhanids also raises a broader question about the nature of their state. For a long time, historians contrasted the Karakhanid system with that of the Samanids. The Samanid state was often imagined as centralized, while the Karakhanid order was described as one dominated by appanages and revenue grants. Yet the reality was more complicated. Under the Samanids too, important cities and provinces could be assigned to princes or high officials in return for service. These were not always permanent or hereditary, but they existed within the heart of the state itself. This means the Samanid system was already less centralized than it was once thought to be. The Karakhanids did not invent this pattern, but they expanded it. In their early period, the system of appanages became more widespread and more deeply woven into the structure of rule. The head of the dynasty held his own domain, while major appanage holders recognized his authority. At the same time, individual towns and regions could be shared economically by several members of the ruling family and even by lesser dependents. This created a layered and complex structure in which political authority and economic rights were divided in ways that often overlapped. Older local elites and leading military figures could also be drawn into this network. The result was not so much a completely new order as an intensified version of tendencies already visible earlier. After the division of the Karakhanid realm into eastern and western branches, this structure began to change. The number of appanages was reduced, central power attempted to grow stronger, and rulers tried to control coinage more closely. Yet later, especially from the second half of the 12th century onward, the trend reversed again. Border appanages became more firmly hereditary and more politically independent. Fergana is the clearest example. There, rulers no longer felt obliged to mention their overlords on their coins. The older multi-layered structure of overlapping rights gave way to more separate and self-contained territorial lordships. Not all important domains even belonged to the dynasty itself. Bukhara, for example, effectively fell under the control of a powerful clerical family that held authority there on a hereditary basis. They collected taxes and ran the city's affairs, while tribute was passed onward to the Kara Kitai through a special envoy. Even though coins in Bukhara still carried Karakhanid names, the local balance of power had shifted strongly away from the ruling dynasty. This kind of arrangement shows that the political world of late Karakhanid Transoxiana cannot be understood simply by borrowing models from Seljuk history or by forcing every territorial grant into a single category. One more feature of the period deserves attention. Members of the Karakhanid dynasty clearly understood how insecure political power could be. Rights over tax income or urban revenue could be lost with a fall from favour, a military defeat, or a change in dynastic fortune. For that reason, they tried whenever possible to acquire secure private property. Lands, shops, gardens, and other sources of revenue could be purchased and legally registered as personal possessions. Such property was protected by law in a way that temporary political grants were not. These holdings could be sold, inherited, donated, or turned into religious endowments. The Karakhanids were especially active as builders, and many of their constructions were maintained through such endowments. Hospitals, schools, mosques, caravanserais, and mausoleums required a permanent source of income if they were to survive. Religious endowments offered precisely that. They also provided a way for rulers to protect wealth for their descendants in an age when thrones and territories were constantly at risk. In this way, even as the dynasty weakened politically, it left behind a lasting imprint on the cities, institutions, and legal culture of Transoxiana. During the 11th and 12th centuries, urban life across Transoxiana did not stand still. Towns continued to develop, trade remained active, and craft production grew in both scale and refinement. Yet this growth did not always take the form of dramatic outward expansion. In many older towns, the broad phase of physical enlargement had already ended by the 10th century. Their suburban belts had reached the limits set by defensive walls, and from that point onward development took a different shape. Instead of spreading farther outward, these cities became denser within their existing boundaries. Markets expanded, workshops multiplied, and commercial premises increasingly filled the outer quarters. In some other places, however, especially along the borders of the state and near the steppe frontier, urban growth did continue in a more visible spatial sense. There, towns expanded in both size and strategic importance, shaped by their position between the settled world and the nomadic sphere. The balance among older urban centres also changed. In some regions, cities that had once been secondary rose to new prominence, while former capitals lost their earlier dominance. Fergana offers one of the clearest examples. Under the Samanids, Aksikath had been the principal city of the region, followed by other important settlements such as Kuba and Ush. Uzgend, though already significant, had been smaller and less central. Under the Karakanids, that order changed. Uzgend rose to become the main city of Fergana and the political centre of the region. At the same time, towns such as Marginan and Kasan also gained weight. This was not merely a shift in administrative labels. It reflected deeper economic and political changes, including the redistribution of trade, the movement of population, and the way power was now anchored in different urban nodes. A similar pattern can be seen farther west, in the districts of Chach and Alak, the rich zones watered by the Chirchik and Angren rivers. Under the Samanids, this had already been one of the most urbanized areas in Transoxiana, crowded with towns in a relatively compact region. The chief centres there had long been Bingkath and Tungkath. Under the Karakanids, however, Binakat and Naukat began to overshadow them. Yet this was not a story of total decline and replacement. The older towns continued to function, and archaeological evidence shows that all of these sites remained active through the 11th and 12th centuries. On the middle, Sirdaria, meanwhile, older towns expanded and new ones appeared. Isfijab remained important, still held by a local Turkic ruling line that managed to preserve its position even under Karakanid authority. Otra also grew in significance and later became an independent appanage under the Karakanids of Fergana. What emerges from all of this is a landscape of shifting urban priorities, rather than simple rise or fall. Every town had its bazaars and caravanserais, and these were central to its economic life. But the working life of the town was not confined to formal market buildings. Craft booths lined the streets, clung to the walls of caravanserais, and spread into busy quarters, where traffic and trade were thickest. Urban space was commercial space, and the boundary between workshop, stall, warehouse, and passageway was often fluid. The roads linking towns were also shaped by this economic energy. Caravan trade remained lively, and the ribats and roadside inns built or maintained under the Karakanids show how regular and important long-distance exchange had become. These were not empty monuments. They served merchants, travellers, guards, pack animals, and the wider movement of goods that tied together the cities of Transoxiana with the rest of Central Asia and the Islamic world. Within the towns, bathhouses were among the most important features of everyday life. There were baths for men and for women, and they were valued not only for comfort and cleanliness, but also as profitable properties. A bathhouse, like a caravanserai, could generate reliable income, which made it attractive both to private owners and to those seeking to endow charitable or religious institutions. Some were originally private property and later transferred into pious endowment. In Bukhara, one Karakanid ruler is remembered for building 2 especially splendid royal baths. In Samarkand, the records attached to religious endowments mention many baths among the properties linked to hospitals and schools. Around such buildings, other small commercial structures also gathered, including workshops and stalls attached to the outer walls. The town was therefore not just a collection of residences and monuments. It was a closely interwoven environment of worship, hygiene, trade, production, and movement. There is also evidence that the urban authorities took cleanliness and public order seriously. Streets and alleys were treated as communal space, and the dumping of rubbish into them was forbidden. Waste disposal was organised through deep rubbish and sewage pits, covered with wooden or ceramic lids, which have been found both in private courtyards and in public spaces. Archaeology also reveals systems of ceramic water pipes, paved surfaces in streets and courtyards, and even the use of blown glass in windows. These details matter because they reveal the practical side of urban civilization. The towns of this period were not simply administrative or commercial centres. They were increasingly sophisticated built environments, with attention paid to infrastructure, circulation, sanitation, and comfort. The development of urban crafts can be traced especially well through ceramics and glass, which survive in large quantities. Under the Karakhanids, pottery developed a highly distinctive style. Techniques changed, colours shifted, and decoration became more varied and inventive. Blue-glazed vessels became especially popular, as did bowls and cups decorated beneath the glaze with elegant geometric and interlaced patterns in brown tones. Kufic lettering did not disappear, but in many cases it ceased to function as readable writing and became a decorative motif in its own right. Unglazed wares also took on new forms. Some were designed to imitate metal vessels with grey bodies covered in relief decoration arranged in horizontal bands. These patterns included geometric shapes, stylized plants, and sometimes even animals. Such pottery wasn't only attractive but increasingly affordable. Technical innovation and the standardization of forms helped bring decorative ceramics within reach of a much broader urban public. One of the most revealing facts is that this urban pottery reached even remote mountain districts. That suggests not only the spread of town-made goods, but also the growing integration of distant populations into the market world of the cities. At the same time, influence flowed in the other direction. Pottery made in towns began to imitate the forms and decoration of handmade wares from mountain communities. This means that urban populations were not growing only through the movement of lowland peasants and settled Turks. Mountain people were also entering the towns, and their tastes began to shape urban production. The city was absorbing people from different environments, and craftsmen responded accordingly. Glassware also speaks to the changing character of daily life. Archaeologists have found a wide variety of vessels, including small bottles for perfumes and medicines, bowls, cups without stems, and long-stemmed drinking glasses. Made in transparent or coloured glass, such items were no longer reserved for the wealthy alone. Glass had become a normal part of urban consumption. Metalwork too ranged from the luxurious to the practical. Finely engraved and silver inlaid bronze vessels existed for elite use, but more modest versions with little decoration also circulated more widely. The picture that emerges is one of growing material variety and a steady spread of objects once considered prestigious into broader layers of urban society. Architecture changed as well. During the 11th and 12th centuries, baked brick was used more extensively, especially in major public and religious construction. Palaces, mosques, madrasas, mausoleums, and bridges all made use of it. Decorative brickwork became an art in itself, joined by carved terracotta and epigraphic ornament. Inscriptions in Kufit and Naskh scripts, raised in relief and framed by vegetal and geometric designs, turned architecture into a surface for visual sophistication as well as structural strength. Several monuments from the Karakhanid period still survive, including mausoleums in Fergana, the Mosque of Magok-i-Atari, and the Great Karlan Minaret in Bukhara, and the famous Rubat-i-Malik between Bukhara and Samarkand. These structures show how deeply urban wealth, craft skill, and religious patronage had become intertwined. At the same time that the towns of Transoxiana were growing and refining their character, another force was gathering beyond their horizons. The beginnings of the Seljuks are partly hidden in uncertainty, but their rise would reshape the region. They belonged to the Kinnik branch of the Oghuz Turks, a group regarded in later tradition as one of the leading tribes among the Oghuz. In the early and middle decades of the 10th century, the Oghuz were nomads of the steppe lands north of the Aral Sea and east of the Caspian, ranging widely across the grasslands. Compared with more developed political societies in neighbouring regions, they were still at a relatively early stage of cultural and political organisation. One of the earliest reliable descriptions of them comes from a traveller from the Abbasid world who passed through their lands on the way to the Volga. He described them as wandering people with animistic beliefs, loosely guided by shamans, but lacking a strongly organised religious life. They lived as steppe nomads, mobile and harshly independent. At this stage, the Oghuz may still have had some relationship with the Khazar world to the west, and their broader movement southward may have been driven in part by pressure from other Turkic peoples farther north. Their leader bore the title of Yabgu, an old Turkic designation, and beneath him were men holding military office. Among the dim ancestral figures later linked to the Seljuks was Seljuk himself, son of a man called Dukak. Seljuk first rose as a military commander under the Oghuz Yabgu, but this relationship did not last. The Yabgu seems to have viewed him as a threat. At some point in the later 10th century, Seljuk and his followers broke away and moved up the Sir Darya to Jand. That move proved decisive. Jand stood near the frontier of the Islamic world, and there the Seljuk family and its retainers began to embrace Islam. This happened in the wider context of gradual Islamic expansion among Turkic peoples living on the northern edges of Muslim power. Later, Seljuk tradition would present this shift in heroic terms, claiming that the family immediately became fighters for the faith. Whether or not such stories are literal, the broader point is clear. The Seljuks were entering a new political and religious sphere. Their place on the frontier gave them military value, and they soon became useful to Muslim rulers. The Samanids, under growing pressure from the Karakhanids to the north, recruited Seljuk warriors to help defend their frontier. Forces under Seljuk leadership were drawn into the struggles around Transoxiana, and in time, some of them were allowed to settle in the zone between Bukhara and Samarkand. Seljuk himself, however, did not move south permanently, and died at Jand in the early 11th century. After his death, leadership passed to his son Arslan. By taking the title of Yabgu, Arslan was making a bold statement. He was not just leading his own band. He was claiming precedence within the larger Oghuz world, setting the Seljuk branch in rivalry with the older ruling line from which the family had once split. That rivalry would continue for years and would remain part of the larger struggle for steppe leadership. Within the Seljuk family itself, authority was not entirely fixed. Different bands of Oghuz followed different figures, among them Togril, Chagri, and Musa. As later events would show, these groups did not always move together as a single united people. Still, they were being drawn more and more into the politics of the settled lands. When the Karakhanids and Ghaznavids divided the former Samanid territories, the Seljuks and their allies appeared on different sides at different times. They fought for those who could offer pasture, plunder, and opportunity. They shifted loyalties pragmatically, and this flexibility became one of their greatest strengths. Arslan gave support to Ali Tegin of Bukhara, and even married into his family, increasing Seljuk influence in Transoxiana. But other members of the Seljuk house, especially Togril and Chagri, seem to have remained somewhat outside those arrangements. Their followers stayed farther west in the steppes and deserts beyond Sogdiana. At some point in the early 11th century, there are reports of long-distance Seljuk raids, moving westward across northern Iran toward Azerbaijan and eastern Anatolia. Whether every detail of these stories is exact is difficult to know. But what matters is that by the mid-1020s, Turkmen groups were certainly beginning to cross the Great Desert Belt and trouble the northern edges of Khorasan. This movement southward was encouraged by larger political pressures. Mahmud of Ghazna allied himself with one Karakhanid ruler against Ali Tegin, and the resulting upheaval helped drive Turkmen auxiliaries away from Transoxiana. Mahmud clearly saw them as dangerous and captured Arslan, sending him away to imprisonment in India, where he eventually died. Without him, the Turkmens fragmented. Separate bands wandered toward Khorasan under minor leaders, while Togrul and Chagri had not yet fully established their authority over all of them. Some of these groups asked permission to settle in northern Khorasan, claiming they would defend the frontier from other nomads. Mahmud allowed a number of families to settle near towns such as Farawa, Sarax, and Abiwad. The result was immediate trouble. The Turkmens raided the surrounding districts, and their herds damaged the agriculture of the oases. When local people complained, Mahmud responded first with punishment, and then with a personal campaign. He defeated the Turkmens heavily and scattered them. Some fled to the hills south of the Caspian, others into the desert margins, and still others farther west into northern Iran. Those western-moving bands later became known as the Iraqi Turkmens, because they penetrated as far as western Iran. Under various leaders, they turned into a major source of disorder in regions such as Rey and Jibal. Ghaznavid princes and local rulers sometimes used them as auxiliaries, but they were never easy to control. At the same time, other Turkmen bands remained near the Karakum and kept raiding Khorasan. The picture was one of scattered but dangerous movement, with multiple groups acting independently and often competing with each other. Meanwhile, another branch of the Seljuk followers had stayed in Sogdiana and later moved into Khwarezm, where they were granted lands by the Ghaznavid governor Altuntash. After his death, his son Harun drifted away from Ghaznavid loyalty and allied himself both with Ali Tegin and with the Seljuks. That arrangement brought the Seljuks back toward the lower Oxus and closer to their ancestral steppe zone. There, they came into conflict with the older Oghuz leadership still centered around Jand. Shah Malik, the ruler of that branch, attacked the Seljuks and inflicted a severe defeat, killing thousands of their followers and carrying off captives and booty. Even efforts at mediation failed. Political conditions then shifted again. Ali Tegin died, his sons continued the anti-Ghaznavid alignment, and a broader campaign was planned against Ghaznavid territory, with Seljuk involvement. But before it could succeed, Harun was assassinated at Mas'ud's order, and the offensive collapsed. This left the Seljuks in a difficult position. Defeated in Khwarezm and under pressure from multiple sides, they turned again toward northern Khorasan and sought permission to settle there as frontier auxiliaries. Mas'ud received their request. His civilian advisors suggested cautious acceptance, but memories of earlier Turkmen depredations shaped the mood at court. Instead of granting settlement on favourable terms, Mas'ud sent a large army against them. At first the Seljuks were driven back, but in 1035 they achieved a surprising victory near Nasser. Their light cavalry, moving quickly and fighting without the burdens of a large conventional army, defeated the heavier Ghaznavid force. The triumph astonished even the victors. They seized great booty in arms, horses, money, and supplies, and this success changed everything. Mas'ud was forced to negotiate. He assigned them districts such as Nasser, Farawa, and Dihistan, and granted them the outward marks of recognized authority. Yet neither side trusted the other. Mas'ud tried to divide the Seljuk leaders and proposed alliances by marriage, but suspicions remained strong. The Seljuks soon demanded additional lands, including rich regions such as Merv. The Sultan could not accept this. At the same time, the Turkmens were raiding widely and opening contacts with Ghaznavid enemies. New armies were sent west, but Mas'ud still failed to understand how serious the danger had become, continuing to spend time on Indian campaigns, while the West slipped from his grasp. In 1038, another Ghaznavid force was badly defeated, and the road to Nishapur lay open. The Seljuks now entered the capital of Khorasan. One of their commanders arrived first with a small mounted force, and soon afterward Togril was acclaimed in the city. Later tradition presents this as the moment when he began acting openly as a sovereign, sitting on the ruler's throne, hearing complaints and adopting exalted titles. Whether every detail is exact or not, the symbolic importance is undeniable. The Seljuks were no longer merely frontier nomads seeking pasture. They were stepping into the center of Islamic political life. Masud tried to respond. He allied himself with Shah Malik against the Seljuks and against rebellious forces in Khwarezm. He gathered a great army for Khorasan. Some Seljuk leaders still feared the power of the Ghaznavids and even considered retreating westward. For a time, Masud managed to reoccupy Nishapur and prepare a full-scale campaign. But Khorasan had already been devastated by war, movement, and the trampling of nomadic herds. Food and fodder were scarce. The Ghaznavid army, burdened by baggage, supplies, and even war elephants, was ill-suited to fight in the desert conditions between Sarax and Merv. In May 1040, near the outpost of Dandankan, the decisive battle was fought. There, 16,000 mobile Turkmens broke the Ghaznavid army, which had already been weakened by thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. It was one of the great turning points in the history of the Eastern Islamic world. Masud fled, aiming for India and fearing that Khorasan and Afghanistan alike might be lost. He never recovered. A mutiny among his own troops ended his life before he could rebuild his power. The Seljuks, by contrast, had won more than a battlefield victory. They had opened the road to empire. After the decisive victory at Dandankan, Togril did not hesitate. On that very battlefield he declared himself the ruler of Khorasan and acted no longer as a wandering tribal leader, but as a sovereign with a defined realm. Messages announcing the triumph were sent in all directions. They reached the Karakhanid princes in Transoxiana, the rulers of Iran, and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. These letters described the hardships the Turkmen forces had endured under earlier rulers and presented the Seljuks as loyal defenders of Sunni Islam. At the head of the message stood an ancient Turkic emblem, a bow and arrow symbolizing both heritage and authority. This moment marked a transformation. Power was no longer tied only to tribal strength or mobility across the steppe. It was now territorial, administrative, and political. Following long-standing Turkic traditions, authority was shared among members of the ruling family. Togril remained the supreme figure, but he distributed lands and responsibilities among his relatives. His brother, Chagri Beg, received control over Khorasan and any lands north of the Oxus that could be brought under Seljuk rule. Merv became his base. Another leading figure, Musa Yabgu, established himself in Herat and extended influence towards Sistan, where local rulers accepted Seljuk authority. Yet the Seljuks were newcomers to governing a structured state. The lands they had taken over possessed long-established administrative systems, shaped by Persian and Islamic traditions. Running such territories required skills that the nomadic leaders did not possess on their own. As a result, they relied heavily on local officials, secretaries, and administrators who had previously served under earlier regimes. Many of these men shifted their allegiance from the Ghaznavids to the Seljuks. In Nishapur, Togril depended on prominent local figures, while experienced bureaucrats took up key positions in the new administration. This blending of steppe leadership with established administrative expertise became one of the foundations of Seljuk power. The years that followed were spent securing control over eastern Iran and pushing westward. Chagri Beg took responsibility for stabilizing the eastern regions. He captured Balkh and brought surrounding territories under Seljuk authority, despite attempts by the Ghaznavids to recover them. His son, Alp Arslan, led further campaigns along the Upper Oxus, gradually establishing a stable frontier between the Seljuks and the Ghaznavids. In other areas, Seljuk commanders extended control into Sistan and beyond, while members of the ruling family established semi-independent domains, such as the one in Kerman, which would endure for generations. In the north, Khwarezm became another important arena. A long-standing rival from the older Oghuz leadership, Shah Malik, had briefly taken control there, but Seljuk forces eventually drove him out, ending the rivalry that had once divided the Oghuz world. Khwarezm was then placed under Seljuk control, though unrest occasionally flared. At the same time, alliances were forged with steppe leaders, including a Kipchak ruler who accepted Islam and joined the Seljuk network through marriage ties. While Chagri secured the east, Togril turned toward western Iran. His relative Ibrahim Inal advanced into regions such as Gurgan and Tabaristan, bringing them under Seljuk authority. Turkmen groups that had previously operated independently were drawn into the expanding Seljuk sphere. Pressure from these movements pushed some groups further west, even toward Byzantine and Armenian lands. Togril himself soon entered the city of Rey, which had suffered heavily from years of conflict. There, he began rebuilding, establishing new administrative centers, religious buildings, and educational institutions. Rey became his new capital, replacing Nishapur, and coins were minted in his name, signaling the consolidation of his authority. From this base, Seljuk expansion continued. Local rulers were forced into submission or accepted vassal status. In Isfahan, Togril imposed his authority and eventually made it another center of power. In the south and west, the Buyid rulers were weakened by internal conflicts, creating opportunities for Seljuk intervention. Turkmen forces penetrated deeper into these regions, and rival claimants among local dynasties sought Seljuk support. By the mid-11th century, the Seljuks had become a decisive force across much of Iran. The turning point came with the entry into Baghdad. Under the pretext of a pilgrimage and the defense of Sunni Islam, Togril advanced toward the Abbasid capital. In 1055 he entered the city, removed the existing ruling authority, and established his own dominance. Within a few years he met the Caliph in person. In a series of formal ceremonies, the Caliph granted him titles that recognized his political authority across both eastern and western lands. His name was proclaimed in the main mosque, marking his position as protector of the Caliph and leader of the Islamic world's political order. This arrangement introduced a new balance of power. The Caliph remained the symbolic and religious head of the Muslim community, while the Sultan exercised real political and military authority. Though initially unfamiliar, this division would shape the political structure of the Islamic world for generations. In the later years of his life, Togril focused on maintaining control over his expanding domains. Governance in the east remained largely in the hands of Chagri Beg, who continued to rule from his base in Khorasan. Regions such as Sistan retained local dynasties under Seljuk oversight, while areas like Kerman developed into stable and prosperous territories under Seljuk princes. Trade routes passing through these regions contributed to their economic strength, linking Central Asia with the Persian Gulf and beyond. Meanwhile, the Seljuks maintained a careful balance with the Ghaznavids. A frontier line was established in what is now northern Afghanistan, and for decades it remained relatively stable. Cultural influence flowed across this boundary, with Seljuk practices shaping developments within Ghaznavid territories. Over time, the Ghaznavid state shifted its focus increasingly toward the Indian subcontinent. After Togril's death, power passed to Alp Arslan, the son of Chagri Beg. His rule, followed by that of his son Malik Shah, represented the height of Seljuk power. Their empire stretched across vast territories, rivaling the scale of earlier great empires. A key figure in maintaining this system was the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, an experienced administrator who brought continuity from earlier Persian traditions. Under his guidance, the machinery of government functioned effectively, combining steppe leadership with a refined bureaucratic structure. Alp Arslan spent much of his reign securing the empire's frontiers, particularly in the west. His most famous victory came against the Byzantine Empire at Manzikert, a battle that opened Anatolia to Turkish expansion. In the east, territories were distributed among members of the ruling family, ensuring both control and loyalty. Malik Shah continued these policies, strengthening the empire further. Relations with neighbouring states remained stable, and cultural influence expanded across regions. Internal conflicts did arise, particularly among members of the ruling family, but the central authority remained strong during his reign. The situation changed after Malik Shah's death. Rivalries among his heirs led to years of conflict and instability. Different branches of the Seljuk family competed for control, weakening the unity of the empire. During this period, regional powers gained more independence, and the balance of authority shifted. In the eastern regions, however, Sanjar emerged as a dominant figure. Appointed as governor of Khorasan while still young, he would rule the region for decades. At first, he acknowledged the authority of the central sultan, but over time, he asserted his own position. Eventually, he became the leading figure within the Seljuk family, exercising authority over both eastern territories and, at times, influencing affairs in the west. Sanjar maintained control over Transoxiana, intervening when necessary to manage disputes among the Karakhanid rulers. His campaigns ensured that Seljuk influence remained strong across the region. He also dealt with the Ghaznavids, who by this time had become more focused on India. In one major intervention, he defeated a Ghaznavid ruler, installed a new one, and secured their submission. For decades, they remained his vassals. To the north, Khwarezm grew increasingly important. Governed by a line of rulers originally appointed by the Seljuks, it gradually developed into a powerful state in its own right. Under rulers like Atsiz, tensions with Sanjar increased. Rebellions broke out, and military campaigns followed. Although Sanjar achieved victories and temporarily imposed control, resistance persisted. The people of Khwarezm resisted outside rule, and local leaders continued to assert their independence. These struggles reveal the limits of Seljuk authority. While the empire had expanded rapidly and achieved remarkable power, maintaining control over distant regions proved increasingly difficult. Local ambitions, regional identities, and shifting alliances all played a role in shaping the political landscape. A new force entered the political landscape of Central Asia in the 12th century, reshaping the balance of power in ways few could have predicted. This force was the Kara Kitai, a people originating from eastern Mongolia and northern China, known in earlier sources as the Khitan or Liao. Moving steadily westward, they established themselves in the region of Semirachiye and Transoxania, with their centre at Balasagun. Under the leadership of their ruler, who held the title Gur Khan, they launched campaigns against both Muslim and non-Muslim Turkic rulers across western Turkestan. Their expansion inevitably brought them into conflict with the Karakhanids. In 1137, the Karakhanid ruler of Samarkand suffered defeat near Kujand. Soon after, internal conflicts within the Karakhanid state led rival factions to invite the Kara Kitai into their struggles. This intervention triggered a wider confrontation. The Seljuk Sultan Sanjar entered Transoxania with a powerful army to restore order. But in 1141, on the Katwan steppe, his forces were decisively defeated. This moment marked a turning point. Sanjar and his ally retreated, and Transoxania fell under Kara-Khitai influence, while Khwarezm was forced into vassalage. Although this defeat created an opportunity for the Khwarezm Shah Atsiz to expand his power, it is unlikely that he had actively encouraged the Kara-Khitai invasion. Atsiz took advantage of the shifting situation to raid into Khorasan, though Seljuk forces quickly responded and forced him back, even penetrating deep into Khwarezm itself. Despite these counterattacks, Seljuk authority in the region was already weakening. The true collapse of Seljuk control in the east did not come from foreign invasions or rebellious vassals, but from internal tensions within Khorasan. The region contained large populations of nomadic Turkmen groups, many of whom had long-standing ties to the Seljuks. These groups had traditionally been managed through special arrangements that allowed communication between tribal leaders and the central government. However, as military campaigns became more expensive, taxation increased dramatically. Both settled populations and nomads were burdened, but it was the Oghuz tribes in particular who rose in rebellion against harsh tax collection practices. Sultan Sanjar attempted to suppress these revolts through military force, but his campaigns failed. He suffered repeated defeats and was eventually captured by the Oghuz in 1153. For several years he was held in humiliating conditions, while chaos spread across Khorasan. Nomadic bands swept through cities and rural areas alike, attacking officials, destroying institutions, and undermining the fragile structure of governance. Urban groups also took advantage of the breakdown of authority, leading to widespread insecurity. When Sanjar finally escaped, he returned to a shattered realm and died shortly afterward. His death symbolized the end of Seljuk dominance in eastern Persia. Although branches of the dynasty survived in western Iran and Kerman for a few decades longer, their power steadily declined under pressure from regional rulers and continuing unrest. In the aftermath of Sanjar's capture, authority in Khorasan fragmented. Various military commanders and local rulers divided the region among themselves. Some former Seljuk officers established stable control over key cities, while others struggled to maintain order. The Oghuz tribes, despite their military strength, failed to form a unified state, which allowed experienced commanders to reassert partial control. However, this fragile balance did not last. In the later 12th century, new powers began to expand into the region. The Ghurids moved westward, while the Khwarezm Shahs grew stronger and increasingly ambitious. By the early 13th century, the Khwarezmian state had become the dominant power in the Eastern Islamic world. The rise of the Khwarezm Shahs was rooted in careful political strategy. Atsiz, the founder of their power, had skillfully balanced his position between stronger neighbours, maintaining loyalty when necessary, while gradually expanding his territory. His successors inherited a stronger and more independent state. Il-Arslan, who ruled after Atsiz, took advantage of the weakening Seljuks and focused on consolidating power north of the Oxus. The Kara-Khitai remained his overlords, but they demanded only tribute and generally avoided interference. This allowed the Khwarezm Shahs to pursue their own ambitions, particularly in Transoxania, where internal conflicts among the Karakhanids created opportunities for intervention. The true transformation came under Ala al-Din Turkish. During his reign, the Khwarezmian state reached new heights. Turkish fought both the Ghurids and remaining Seljuk forces, gradually extending his control across Iran. He also maneuvered diplomatically, sometimes seeking support from the Kara-Khitai when it suited his interests, while at other times presenting himself as a defender of Islam against non-Muslim powers. His campaigns brought him into western Iran, where he defeated the last Seljuk ruler in the region. This victory effectively ended Seljuk authority in Persia. Tekish then expanded his rule across Jabal and beyond, even gaining recognition from the Abbasid Caliph, who acknowledged his authority over large parts of Iran and neighbouring lands. Tekish's successor, Ala al-Din Muhammad, inherited a vast and powerful empire. He continued his father's expansionist policies, focusing first on securing the eastern frontiers. The decline of the Jurids allowed him to take control of Khorasan, while unrest within the Kara-Kite domains created further opportunities. By forming alliances with local rulers in Transoxania, he was able to challenge Kara-Kite authority and eventually establish control over major cities such as Samarkand. However, his rule was not universally welcomed. In several regions, local populations resisted Khwarezmian authority, leading to uprisings and violent reprisals. His campaigns extended north into the steppe regions and west toward Iraq, where he even considered overthrowing the Abbasid Caliph. Yet this ambition was never realized, as new threats began to emerge from the east. At the same time, the internal structure of these states reflected a blend of military power and administrative organization inherited from earlier traditions. The Seljuk system relied on a centralized bureaucracy supported by provincial governors, military commanders, and local leaders who acted as intermediaries with the population. Land grants provided the economic foundation for this system, tying military service to revenue collection. The Khwarezm Shahs adopted similar structures but increasingly centralized authority as their empire expanded. This centralization placed heavy demands on resources, leading to widespread taxation and discontent. Their armies, often composed of steppe warriors, gained a reputation for harshness, further alienating the populations they ruled. Despite these tensions, certain regions continued to flourish economically. Khwarezm itself became a center of wealth and agricultural productivity, supported by extensive irrigation systems. Cities were prosperous and densely populated, with active markets and thriving trade networks. However, this prosperity masked deeper instability. The rapid expansion of the Khwarezmian Empire had not been matched by the creation of strong political bonds between rulers and subjects. As a result, when external pressures intensified, the state proved vulnerable. To the east and southeast of Herat and south of Karchistan and Guzgan lay the rugged land of Gur, a region shaped by high mountains, isolated valleys, and broken terrain. Its territory stretched across the upper basins of the Hari Rud, the Farah Rud, the Rud-i-Gur, and the Khash Rud, separated by steep ridges and difficult passes. This geography defined the history of the region. Gur did not grow around one dominant city or one central seat of power. Instead, authority was divided among many local strongholds. Each fortress controlled only the land within its immediate reach, and political unity remained weak for a very long time. In this environment, tribal customs and patriarchal rule survived deeply. Even by the mid-12th century, only a limited part of Gur had developed something like a capital, when Firuzkoh emerged as the center of one branch of local power. Settlement across the region was scattered rather than continuous. People lived in small pockets, often protected by towers, fortresses, and naturally defensible heights. The outside world touched Gur only faintly. New political and cultural currents that transformed neighbouring lands often reached this mountain zone only in weakened form. Early Muslim armies passed near its edges more than once, but they did not immediately change the character of the region. For centuries, Gur remained remote, difficult to control, and only partially connected to the broader Islamic world. Its people also stood apart in language and culture. The dialect spoken in Gur differed noticeably from the Persian of Khorasan, and outsiders often needed interpreters to communicate with local communities. Even the pronunciation of Islamic names could sound unfamiliar to those from the lowlands. The ethnic background of the Gurids later became surrounded by legend, and their origins were remembered as much through heroic stories as through clear historical memory. Over time, the region was exposed to different influences from the surrounding world. After the campaigns of the Saffarids in the neighbouring south, Gur became more accessible to various tribes and peoples. Contact with Ghazna opened the way for Turkic elements to enter from nearby territories. Later, Guz and Karlaj groups settled along the fringes of the mountains, gradually weakening Gur's old isolation and adding new ethnic layers to the population. Still, the region remained distinct for a long time, and its transformation was slow rather than sudden. The spread of Islam into Gur was a gradual and incomplete process. Even toward the end of the 10th century, much of the population still followed older beliefs, and the region was seen as one of the last major non-Muslim enclaves within lands otherwise claimed by Islamic rulers. Conversion came not through one dramatic conquest, but through a long and uneven process of contact, missionary activity, and political change. Religious influence from Khorasan played an important role, especially through austere Sunni movements that found followers in the region. Over time, local rulers adopted Islam, yet this did not mean that older customs vanished overnight. In many places, Muslim names existed alongside ways of life that still preserved pre-Islamic habits and values. The shift was real, but it was far from complete. As the years passed, several centres along the Hari Rud Valley began to gain prominence. Firuzkoh rose as the political heart of Shansabani rule, while Jam and Chisht also developed importance. These places became islands of growing power within a region still marked by fragmentation and mountain autonomy. Gur was not only isolated, it was also rich in resources that mattered greatly in medieval warfare. Its mountains contained deposits of iron and other metals, and the region became known for metalworking. Armour, weapons, and military equipment were produced there and exported to neighbouring lands. One of its chief strongholds was even known as the Bridge of the Blacksmiths, a name that reflected the importance of this craft. Both the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks demanded tribute from Gur in the form of weapons, cuirasses, and the fierce guard dogs bred in its highlands. Gurid men were valued as specialists in siege warfare, and while parts of the region were still outside the Islamic world, slaves from Gurs were sold in nearby markets. The region was also famous for horse breeding. In an age when military power depended heavily on cavalry and forged iron, Gur possessed two of the most valuable assets a rising power could hope for. When the Gurids eventually expanded, they did so with the advantage of their own horses, their own weapons, and a society already accustomed to harsh terrain and martial traditions. The ruling house of Gur later surrounded itself with a noble and semi-mythical ancestry. According to dynastic tradition, the Shanzabani line traced its roots back to Zahak, one of the great figures of Iranian legendary memory. Whether this was history or political symbolism mattered less than the message it carried. The rulers of Gur wanted to present themselves as ancient, legitimate, and deeply rooted in the Iranian past. The early history of the region remains difficult to reconstruct in detail, but the broad outline is clear. Arab armies raided Gur from time to time during the 7th and 8th centuries. Yet these expeditions seem to have been aimed more at plunder and captives than lasting control. They did not establish deep religious or administrative structures there. Much later, tradition speaks of an early prince named Amir Banji, remembered as an ancestor of the Shanzabani rulers, and as a man whose authority had been recognized by the caliph. Whether every detail of that memory is reliable is less important than the fact that later, Gurid historians treated him as the founder of legitimate rule in the mountains. By the late 9th century, Gur had entered the orbit of larger regional struggles. The Safarid ruler, Yaqub ibn Layth, pushed through neighbouring lands and conquered several districts around Gur. But the heart of the mountain country remained protected by its inaccessibility. In the late 10th century, the Samanids also attempted to conquer it. They captured a few forts, yet they could not fully subdue the region. Then came the Ghaznavids. Sebüktigin launched repeated attacks on Gur, while ruling Ghazna and Zabulistan in the name of the Samanids. After setbacks, he succeeded in imposing his authority over eastern parts of the region, and one local ruler acknowledged him as overlord. But once Sebüktigin died, tribute payments stopped, local resistance returned, and the frontier again became unstable. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna responded forcefully. In 1011, he sent armies into Gur, defeated the local ruler, Muhammad ibn Suri, and took him prisoner along with one of his sons. Mahmud then installed another son, Abu Ali, as his client in Mandish, thereby extending Ghaznavid influence into eastern Gur. A few years later, Mahmud sent his son Masud to subdue the northwestern districts as well, pressing deeper into the mountainous interior than earlier invaders had managed. Even so, Ghaznavid control remained fragile. Internal rivalries soon returned. Abu Ali was overthrown by a nephew, and local unrest forced the Ghaznavids to intervene again. Ibrahim of Ghazna marched into Gur with a large army, and the local forces quickly abandoned the usurper. The Ghaznavids restored order and placed power in the hands of a more cooperative ruler, who resumed tribute payments. Yet true stability came only later under Izz al-Din Hussein, who ruled in the early 12th century. He restored peace after a period of tribal conflict and reasserted control across much of the region. During the age of Seljuk power, Sanjar campaigned against Gur and even took Izz al-Din Hussein prisoner, but later allowed him to return. From then on, tribute flowed from Gur to Merv, including armour, war equipment, and the famous mountain hounds of the region. Gur was still subordinate, but had become stronger, more organised, and more capable of acting as a political force in its own right. The real rise of the Gurids began with the sons of Izz al-Din Hussein. These brothers divided their inheritance among themselves and established control over various branches of the family domain. In doing so, they laid the foundation for expansion beyond the mountains. One branch ruled Bamiyan and Tukharistan. Another held Gur and Firuzkoh. Another moved toward Ghazna, while others secured neighbouring districts. This division did not weaken the dynasty at first. On the contrary, it allowed the Shansabani family to spread its authority across a wider landscape. One of the brothers, Qutb al-Din Muhammad, adopted the title Lord of the Mountains, a clear sign that ambition was growing. He established Firuzkoh as a rising political centre and strengthened it with new fortifications. Yet tension within the family also grew. Rivalries between brothers soon entangled the Gurids in a deadly struggle with the Ghaznavids. Qutb al-Din Muhammad went to the court of Bahram Shah of Ghazna, but there he was poisoned. His death ignited a cycle of vengeance that changed the balance of power in the region. His brother, Ala al-Din Hussein, resolved to avenge him and marched against Ghazna. Bahram Shah prepared for war, drawing on forces from Ghazna and from India. When the armies met, the Gurids used defensive battlefield screens made from hides and packed material, forming a moving protective barrier that blunted enemy attacks. The plan worked. Bahram Shah's son was killed, the Ghaznavid army collapsed, and Ala al-Din Hussein stormed Ghazna. What followed became one of the most famous acts of destruction in the history of the Eastern Islamic world. For 7 days and nights, the city was burned. Palaces, monuments, and the grand urban legacy of the Ghaznavids were consumed in fire. Bust also suffered destruction, and the prestige of the Ghaznavid dynasty never recovered. Ala al-Din Hussein earned the name World Burner, a title that captured both the scale of his violence and the shock his campaign caused across the region. From this point onward, the most important figures were the brothers Ghiyath al-Din Muhammad and Muiz al-Din Muhammad. Under them, the Ghurid state reached its height. Ghiyath al-Din built his rule on cooperation within the family rather than rivalry. He worked closely with Muiz al-Din and elevated trusted relatives to positions of high authority. He also established relations with the Abbasid Caliph, gaining moral recognition that strengthened his prestige. Earlier, both brothers had been imprisoned during internal dynastic struggles. But once released, they became the architects of Ghurid greatness. Ghiyath al-Din proved especially skillful at consolidating power within Gur, defeating rivals, and neutralizing competing branches of the family. His control expanded southward into Zamin Dawar, and when local leaders in Herat sought support, he entered that city as well. He further reinforced his position through marriage alliances within the ruling house. Meanwhile, Muiz al-Din was entrusted with strategically important territories and soon emerged as the dynasty's great military commander. Ghiyath al-Din granted him Taghinabad after his campaigns in Sistan, and exploratory raids were launched toward Kabul, Zabul, and Ghazna. At this time, Ghazna had fallen into the hands of the Oghuz, who had pushed the last Ghaznavid ruler back to Lahore. In 1173, the Ghurids recovered Ghazna, and Ghiyath al-Din placed Muiz al-Din on its throne while returning himself to Firuzkoh. This division of roles was highly effective. Ghiyath directed the broader political strategy of the dynasty, while Muiz became the spearhead of its military expansion. Together, they extended Ghurid influence across Herat, Pushang, and much of Khorasan. Their success was so great that rulers in Sistan and even parts of Kirman recognized Ghurid overlordship. Their names were proclaimed in mosques and struck on coinage, the clearest signs of sovereign authority in the medieval Islamic world. The Ghurids also became involved in the turbulent politics of Khwarezm, when a displaced Khwarezmian prince sought refuge at their court. Conflict with the Khwarezm Shah followed. Campaigns and counter-campaigns unfolded across Khorasan, and the Ghurids repeatedly showed that they were now one of the decisive powers in the region. After the death of Tekish, they occupied major cities including Nishapur and Merv, distributing them among loyal relatives and commanders. By this time, the Ghurid state stretched from the mountains of central Afghanistan deep into the Iranian east. Yet the most famous and far-reaching achievements of the dynasty came not in Khorasan, but in the Indian subcontinent. Muiz al-Din led the eastern expansion. His early campaigns into India began with attacks on Multan, where he overthrew the Kalmathian power that had re-emerged there. He then occupied Uchch and pushed into Gujarat. But there he suffered a serious defeat near Mount Abu. That setback forced a strategic rethink. Rather than advancing through Gujarat, he turned toward the Punjab, where the weakening Ghaznavid state still controlled key routes. Peshawar was taken, then Sindh was overrun as far as the coast, and local rulers acknowledged his supremacy. The final blow came with the conquest of Lahore in 1186. After several expeditions, the last Ghaznavid ruler surrendered under the protection of a treaty, only to be executed later along with his son. With that act, nearly 2 centuries of Ghaznavid power came to an end. All the strategic gateways into northern India were now in Ghurid hands. Muiz al-Din's greatest victories followed. In 1192, one battle in the west broke the strength of Khwarezmian opposition on the Murghab, while another at Tarain opened northern India to sustained Ghurid conquest. From that point, Ghurid armies pushed deep into the plains, reaching toward the frontiers of Kashmir and laying the foundations for a new political order in the subcontinent. Ghiyath al-Din died in 1202 and was buried in Herat, but Mu'izz al-Din survived him by a few years and carried the dynasty's military energy even further. By then, the rulers who had once emerged from a remote and fragmented mountain land had transformed themselves into masters of an empire that linked Gur, Ghazna, Khorasan, and northern India. What had begun in isolated valleys, protected by stone fortresses, had become one of the most dramatic imperial expansions of the medieval Eastern Islamic world. The next great test for Mu'izz al-Din came in northern India, where the Chahamanas controlled the powerful stretch of territory running from Ajmer to Delhi. In 1191, he moved against Bhatinda, laid siege to the fortress and captured it. But the victory was only temporary. Prithvi Raj, the Chahamana ruler, advanced quickly to recover the stronghold, and the two sides met at Tarain. There, Mu'izz al-Din suffered a crushing defeat. He was badly wounded in battle and barely escaped with his life, saved only by the intervention of a loyal Khalaj soldier who carried him away from the field and helped him return to Ghazna. Prithvi Raj then turned his attention to Bhatinda itself and, after a long siege that lasted more than a year, recovered the fortress. For many rulers, such a defeat would have marked the end of an Indian campaign. For Mu'izz al-Din, it became the reason to prepare for an even greater return. He spent the following year rebuilding his strength, reorganizing his forces and preparing for another confrontation. When he came back, he did so with overwhelming cavalry power and a clear determination to erase the memory of his earlier defeat. This second clash at Tarain changed the course of North Indian history. The Chahamana forces were broken. Govinda Raj was killed, and Prithvi Raj fell into Ghurid hands. With that victory, the military backbone of the Chahamana kingdom collapsed. The Ghurids quickly moved to secure the strategic points that made control of the region possible. Important centres such as Hansi, Kuhram, and Sarsuti were occupied and garrisoned, and the Siwalik zone was brought under firm authority. With these gains, the road from Peshawar to Hansi came under Ghurid control, creating a long military corridor that tied the Afghan base of the dynasty to its growing Indian conquests. This triumph did not end resistance. In 1196, Bhima Deva of Gujarat tried to reverse Ghurid expansion and recover Ajmer. Qutb al-Din Aibak, Mu'izz al-Din's leading commander in India, found himself trapped in the city for months under siege. Mu'izz al-Din responded by sending reinforcements, forcing Bhima Deva to withdraw toward Gujarat. Aibak did not let the opportunity slip away. He pursued the retreating army toward Nawala and inflicted a decisive defeat. Bhima Deva escaped, but his troops suffered terribly. Many were killed, and many others were taken prisoner. The earlier Ghurid victory at Tarain had opened the political heart of northern India, and Aibak now turned that breakthrough into a wider conquest. In the years that followed, he occupied Meerut, Baran, and Delhi. Mu'izz al-Din returned again and again to push the frontier forward, taking more strongholds and extending his authority through military pressure and political submission. The ruler of Gwalior accepted his overlordship, while Badayon and later Malwa also fell within the Ghurid sphere. Other commanders contributed to this surge of expansion. Bahar al-Din Togril strengthened Ghurid control in areas such as Gwalior and Bayana, helping consolidate gains that might otherwise have remained exposed and unstable. Even more dramatic was the career of Muhammad Bakhtiar Khalji, who swept eastward, displaced local ruling houses, and carried Ghurid power into Bihar and Bengal. His campaigns widened the eastern horizon of the empire more than anyone could have predicted only a few decades earlier. Encouraged by success, he pushed beyond the plains toward the Himalayan world and even in the direction of Tibet. There, however, fortune turned against him. What had been a career of astonishing momentum ended in disaster when the difficulties of terrain, distance, and resistance overwhelmed his advance. Even so, his earlier victories had already transformed the eastern map of the subcontinent. Then, in 1206, Muiz al-Din was assassinated in India. His death created an immediate political vacuum, and the Turkish slave generals who had served him now stepped to the front. Among them, Qutb al-Din Aybak, Taj al-Din Yildiz, and Nasir al-Din Kubacha emerged as the most important. Yet they did not unite to preserve the empire intact. Rivalries quickly appeared, and the cohesion that had depended so much on Muiz al-Din's personal authority began to dissolve. Ghazna drifted away from the Indian possessions, and the old unity of the Ghurid dominion started to break apart. Aybak at first continued to present himself as a loyal servant of the Shansabani house. He had been formally elevated by his master and associated with high authority before Muiz al-Din's death. For a time, he remained content with the titles of military commander and provincial ruler. But as it became clear that the old empire could no longer be held together, he established an independent base of power in India. The collapse of central control in Afghanistan and the growing pressure of the Khwarazm Shahs made this separation permanent, while events in India were reshaping the eastern half of the Ghurid inheritance. Another branch of the dynasty remained important in Bamiyan and the mountain lands of Tukharistan. The Shansabanis had secured this region not long after their victories in Ghazna. Bamiyan was a land famous for its mineral wealth, including gold, silver, and precious stones, and it held both economic and strategic value. Ala al-Din Hussein placed his elder brother, Fakhr al-Din Masood, there in the mid-12th century, making Bamiyan one of the great family strongholds. Fakhr al-Din's son, Shams al-Din Muhammad, expanded his authority further, extending influence across Balkh, Chaghaniyan, Wakhsh, Badakhshan, and several mountain districts. His position became so elevated that he too bore the title of Sultan. His son, Baha al-Din Sam, who followed him, won respect not only as a ruler but also as a patron of scholars and learned men. His court attracted intellectual figures of major stature, giving Bamiyan a cultural importance that matched its political value. For a brief moment, Baha al-Din Sam seemed to offer the Shansabani family a new centre of leadership after the death of Muiz al-Din. The emirs and maliks of Gur, Ghazna, and Bamiyan looked to him as a possible head of the dynasty and invited him to Ghazna. But fate intervened at the worst possible moment. He fell ill and died almost at the same time that Muiz al-Din was assassinated. The coincidence was devastating. What remained of dynastic unity now weakened further. Baha al-Din's sons, Ala al-Din and Jalal al-Din, were called by the Ghurid commanders to take the throne at Ghazna. Jalal al-Din placed his brother there and returned to Bamiyan, but harmony did not last. The wealth of Ghazna was divided between them, and then rivalry broke out over Bamiyan itself. The struggle ended only when the Khwarazm Shah Ala al-Din Muhammad intervened and had Jalal al-Din killed in 1215. With that act, the Ghurid line in its Afghan homelands was effectively extinguished. At its height, the Ghurid state had been one of the largest and most dynamic powers in the Eastern Islamic world. Its territories stretched from Herat, across Afghanistan and northern India, to Bengal, reaching close to Tibet and Kashmir. Such a realm was not held together by geography or inherited imperial institutions alone. It was built through relentless warfare, careful diplomacy, and the ability of its rulers to exploit the decline of older powers. The Ghurids rose in the shadow of the weakening Seljuks and the fading Ghaznavids. They fought a wide range of rivals, including steppe groups, Indian dynasties, regional Muslim powers, and the rising Khwarazm Shahs. Their strength lay not in easy dominance, but in their ability to survive in a competitive world and seize openings faster than others. Yet the same empire that looked so formidable on the map contained deep structural weaknesses. The Ghurids struggled to hold both Khorasan and northern India at the same time. In Khorasan they achieved impressive successes, but they could not make them permanent. The Khwarezm Shahs had greater manpower and deeper military reserves, especially from the Turkic steppe zones to their north. The Ghurids could strike hard, occupy cities, and even dominate the province for short periods, but they could not sustain that dominance in the long term. After Tekish died, they moved rapidly into Khorasan, taking cities such as Nishapur, Merv, Sarax, and Tus, and even pushing farther west. But these gains did not last. Ala al-Din Muhammad of Khwarezm soon recovered much of what had been lost, and although both sides at times sought peace for strategic reasons, the contest remained unresolved. Muiz al-Din still hoped to reverse the situation. After the death of his brother Ghiyath al-Din, he continued to campaign and even invaded Khwarezm itself. But his fortunes changed dramatically after a major defeat near Andkud, where forces allied with the Kara Khitai shattered his army. He escaped safely, but the defeat was a disaster. Most of the Ghurid gains beyond Herat and Balkh were lost, and the dream of dominating Transoxania and Khorasan faded. Even then, Muiz al-Din did not abandon his ambitions. He planned a new campaign across the Oxus, ordered preparations for a bridge, and intended another great advance. That campaign never happened. His assassination in 1206 ended not only a life of conquest, but the last real chance of preserving the Ghurid Empire as a trans-regional power spanning both sides of the Hindu Kush. The political order created by the Ghurids had always reflected the character of the land from which they came. In their mountain homeland, power was originally patriarchal, tribal, and local. Strongholds mattered more than cities, and kinship ties shaped political relations. As their conquests expanded, however, they had to govern very different worlds. Firuzku represented the older mountain tradition, rooted in clan authority and fortress politics. Ghazna carried the legacy of a long-established Turco-Iranian monarchy, with developed court customs and administrative experience. Northern India, meanwhile, had its own decentralized structures, local landed elites, and military traditions. The Ghurid Empire therefore became a political mosaic. It was not a neatly uniform state, but a layered realm made up of several inherited traditions, held together by military success and family leadership. In this setting, recognition from the Abbasid Caliph carried great symbolic importance. Like other Sunni rulers of the Eastern Islamic world, the Ghurids valued formal acknowledgement from Baghdad because it raised their prestige and confirmed their place in the wider order of Islamic sovereignty. Ceremonial honours, robes of distinction, and courtly rituals added moral authority to their rule. They were especially important for Ghiyath al-Din, who sought to present himself not merely as a mountain warlord, but as a legitimate sovereign among the great rulers of his age. Even the choice of capitals reflected the slow transition from tribal leadership to organised monarchy. Firuzku only emerged as a true capital after much effort had been invested in integrating scattered local powers. In time, the need to govern lands beyond Gur also required a winter capital in a warmer region, showing how conquest forced administrative adaptation. Succession within the ruling family never followed a completely rigid system. Tribal custom, family politics, ethnic background, and practical needs all played a role. Seniority mattered, but it was not the only principle. Different branches of the family held different territories, and power was often shared under the loose authority of a leading figure. Ghiyath al-Din and Muiz al-Din both used the title of Sultan, though the elder brother enjoyed acknowledged supremacy. This arrangement gave the dynasty flexibility, but it also made it fragile. The leading Shansabani ruler depended on cooperation from relatives who governed major provinces almost as independent princes. They paid tribute, recognized superior authority on coinage, and upheld the prestige of the dynasty. Yet they also guarded their own power closely. In a world where loyalty shifted quickly, such a system could work brilliantly under strong leadership and unravel just as quickly when that leadership disappeared. The military strength of the Gurids rested on several important advantages. Their homeland provided horses and iron in abundance, two essential resources for war. Their mountainous society produced hard fighters, and the ruling house could also draw on fierce tribal groups from Afghanistan, including Guris and Khaljis. But these manpower reserves were not enough on their own. Like other dynasties of the region, the Gurids relied heavily on purchased Turkish military slaves, who became some of the most effective officers and commanders in their armies. In India, they faced determined resistance from Rajput forces and other established military elites, yet they succeeded in breaking through because they combined mobility, cavalry warfare, and disciplined command. Even so, they made the strategic mistake of sustaining major struggles in two directions at once. One front in India, and another in Khorasan and Central Asia. Over time, that double burden proved too great. Their enemies in the west could mobilize more men, and the Gurids eventually lost the balance. One of the most important institutions under Muizz al-Din was the household of military slaves. He treated many of these men almost like sons, and they became the core of the post-Gurid political order in India. As the older empire disintegrated, it was these commanders who carried forward its military methods, court habits, and political ambitions. In India, figures such as Aibak and later Iltutmish refused to share power in the loose family style of the Shanzabanis. Instead, they pushed toward a more centralized model of kingship suited to the realities of North India. In doing so, they transformed the Gurid inheritance. What had begun as the expansion of a mountain dynasty became the foundation for a durable, new Muslim state in the Indo-Gangetic plain. Administratively, the Gurids developed beyond the simple needs of their early homeland once they took Ghazna and India. They adopted and adapted institutions from the Ghaznavids, and, to some extent, from Seljuk practice as well. The vizier stood at the head of the civil administration. Judicial affairs were supervised by the chief judge, while religious institutions in India came under the oversight of high-ranking officials responsible for pious endowments and clerical affairs. Court ceremony, the organization of the royal household, the supervision of the army, and the logistics of campaigning all came to be handled by specialized officers. In India especially, Gurid, Ghaznavid, and local traditions blended together. Their armies themselves reflected this diversity. Turks, Tajiks, Afghans, and locally recruited Indian soldiers all served within the same military framework, giving the state a practical, multi-ethnic character. Culturally, Gur had once been an isolated mountain world with little urban life. Contact with Ghazna changed that. Through that connection, the Gurids entered the broader cultural sphere of Iran and Central Asia. Early rulers sponsored mosques, madrasas, public works, and fortified settlements. Firuzkoh itself became a symbol of this transformation, growing from a fortified centre into a city of political and cultural importance. Strong fortresses were built across Gur, Garchistan, Herat, and surrounding lands, reflecting both military necessity and increasing state capacity. Archaeological remains from the Gurid period show how their architecture drew from wider Eastern Iranian and Central Asian traditions, while developing a style of its own. The famous discoveries at Jam have also illuminated the grandeur of the world they built. Intellectual life developed alongside political power, Some early rulers took interest in astrology and scholarly pursuits. But under later sultans, patronage became much broader and more serious. Ghiyath al-Din supported religious and educational institutions, especially those tied to Sunni scholarship. Baha al-Din Sam was remembered as an especially generous patron of learned men. Great scholars spent time at Ghurid courts, writing for its rulers and participating in the intellectual life of the dynasty. Religious life also evolved. Earlier, the Karamiyya had exercised strong influence in Gur, but as contact with Ghazna, Herat, and other centres deepened, the ruling family gradually moved away from that older current. Over the course of the 12th century, Ghiyath al-Din adopted the Shafi tradition, while Mu'izz al-Din followed the Hanafi school. This shift reflected not only personal preference, but also the broader integration of Gur into mainstream Sunni Islam. The Ghurids left behind a mixed legacy. In Afghanistan, they destroyed Ghazna with extraordinary violence and helped bring one old political world to an end. In India, however, their role was more enduring and more creative. They transferred to the subcontinent not only armies and governors, but also books, scholars, court culture, and administrative experience from Central Asia and the Eastern Iranian world. As Mongol destruction later devastated many of the older centres of that civilization farther west, the lands once conquered by the Ghurids in India became a refuge and a new home for those traditions. In that sense, the Ghurid achievement did not end with the fall of their own dynasty. Their empire in the mountains vanished, but the institutions, military structures, and cultural energies they carried into India survived and helped shape the next great phase of medieval northern Indian history. The first clear reference to the Uyghurs appear in Chinese records from the early 7th century. At that time, they were living along the Selenga River and remained under the authority of the Turks. Chinese writers often claimed that the Uyghurs descended from the old Xiongnu, the great steppe power of earlier centuries. That idea may preserve some distant memory, but it cannot be verified with certainty. Chinese historians regularly linked many northern peoples to the Xiongnu, so such claims must be treated with caution. What matters more is how the Uyghurs were seen in their own age. In the eyes of their southern neighbours, they belonged to the familiar world of the steppe, mobile, warlike, skilled on horseback, and dependent on pasture and water rather than fixed settlement. Yet behind these old stereotypes stood a people who would soon build one of the most powerful empires of Inner Asia. In the early 7th century, the Uyghurs were still subordinate to the Turks, who relied on them to help manage the distant northern frontier. But around 630, when Turk power was weakening, the Uyghurs began to assert themselves under a leader named Pusa. After his death, his son Tu-mi-tu adopted the title of Khagan, a sign that the Uyghurs were no longer content with subordination. His rule ended violently when he was murdered, and later, members of his family also vanished from the record after struggles involving the Chinese court. For several decades after that, the Uyghurs remained one among several tribal groups within the wider Tirle Confederation, and continued to live inside the political orbit of the Eastern Turk Empire. Their rise to full independence had not yet come. That decisive moment arrived in 744. The Karluks, Bazmils, and Uyghurs united in a common effort to overthrow Turk rule. At first, the victory benefited the Bazmils, whose ruler briefly stood at the head of the new order. But the alliance quickly turned inward. The Uyghurs and Karluks eliminated the Bazmil ruler, and soon afterward the Uyghurs forced the Karluks aside as well. Even then, the Karluks remained a significant and often hostile rival. This was not an outside invasion of the Turk world so much as an internal transfer of power within it. The first Uyghur rulers presented themselves not as destroyers of the Turk political tradition, but as its rightful heirs. They linked their legitimacy to the old Turk founding line and consciously preserved the symbols of continuity. In language, script, and way of life, the Uyghurs and Turks were extraordinarily close. They spoke the same tongue, used the same runic-style writing, and occupied the same steppe zone. If the name had changed, much else had not. In many ways, the Uyghur state in Mongolia was the third great Turk empire. Its first rulers moved quickly to strengthen their position. Kutlug Bilge Kul Kagan laid the foundations, and his son, El-Etmish Bilge Kagan, also remembered as Bayan Chur, expanded and consolidated the new state. One of the most important features of this early Uyghur period was its careful management of relations with China. The Tang dynasty was facing severe internal crisis, especially during the rebellion of An Lushan, and Uyghur military intervention proved crucial. In 757, Uyghur troops helped the Chinese retake Luoyang, and the alliance was further sealed when a Chinese princess was married to the Kagan. This was more than ceremonial diplomacy. It reflected a new balance of power in which the Uyghurs were no longer merely another northern people to be managed by the Chinese Empire. They had become indispensable to it. At the same time, another major transformation was taking shape inside Uyghur society: the growth of urban life. This marked an important development because the steppe world is often imagined as wholly nomadic, yet the Uyghurs increasingly combined pastoral power with fixed centres of authority. Inscriptions from the 8th century refer to Uyghur cities, including a royal residence at the junction of the Orkhon and Baliklig rivers, usually identified with Karabalgasun. Another city, Bey-Balik, was built with the help of Chinese and Sogdian craftsmen on the Selenga. These foundations reveal a new political ambition. A steppe ruler might still prefer the comfort and prestige of a grand tent, but an empire also needed symbolic centres, administrative hubs, and lasting monuments. Arab visitors later described the Eurasian capital as a large and crowded place with markets, many trades, and an urban population that included a large number of Manichaeans. The city stood amid cultivated land, enclosed by great gates, and clearly functioned as more than a seasonal camp. Urbanization among the Uyghurs did not mean the abandonment of steppe traditions. It meant that steppe power had begun to adopt new forms. The most striking ruler of the Uyghur age was Bogu Kagan, who came to power after El-Etmish Bilge Kagan. Like his father, he assisted the Tang in recovering Luoyang, but Uyghur military presence in China often brought devastation as well as aid. Their intervention could save the dynasty, yet the troops were feared for their brutality and indiscipline. Still, the political result was unmistakable. Never before had a Mongolian steppe power occupied such a commanding position in relation to China. The Tang court now depended on Uyghur support in moments of extreme danger. It was during one of these campaigns in China that the most consequential religious shift in Uyghur history took place. In Luoyang, Bogu Kagan was converted to Manichaeism through Sogdian influence. His conversion changed more than his private beliefs. It drew the Uyghur court into much deeper contact with Sogdian religious and commercial networks. Bogu embraced the new faith with the intensity often shown by recent converts. Uyghur Manichaean texts present this as a moment of collective joy and spiritual transformation. Yet the political consequences were more complicated. As Manichaeism rose at court, so too did the influence of the Sogdians who had brought it. Their growing authority alarmed many in the ruling elite. Traditional religious figures saw their own position threatened, while the Uyghur warrior aristocracy resented the prominence of foreign advisors whose interests did not always align with those of the state. The problem was not simply religion. The deeper issue was that Sogdian influence extended into policy, diplomacy, and economic life. Their increasing power created the impression that the Khagan had fallen under outside control. This tension ended in blood. Bogu Khagan was urged by Sogdian advisors toward an aggressive policy against China, but his uncle Tun Bagha Tarkan opposed the plan. When the Khagan refused to listen, Tun Bagha struck first. In 779 he carried out a coup, killed Bogu, and oversaw a massacre that reached beyond the ruler himself to his circle and many associated Sogdians. It was a violent rejection of the previous direction of policy. Even so, the relationship between Uyghurs and Sogdians did not disappear. It was too deeply rooted to be broken so easily. The two had long been bound together by mutual advantage. The Sogdians provided literacy, diplomacy, religious expertise, and above all, commercial skill. The Uyghurs provided military protection and political power. Their partnership had already existed under the Turks and would continue under the Uyghurs, though not without recurring tension. The massacre after Bogu's fall was a temporary eclipse, not a final end to Sogdian importance. Trade lay at the centre of this partnership. The most valuable commodity produced by the Uyghur steppe economy was the horse, and China had a constant military demand for horses. In exchange, the Uyghurs received silk. On paper, this was a conventional frontier trade. In practice, it often became a form of economic pressure. The Uyghurs did not merely satisfy Chinese demand. They pushed more horses into the market than China wanted, sometimes sending animals of poor quality and still demanding high payment in silk. Chinese sources complained bitterly about the burden this imposed. They described the Uyghurs as overbearing, greedy, and shameless in their demands, while at the same time revealing that the transactions continued because China could not afford to alienate them. The official exchange rate was highly favourable to the Uyghurs, and the scale of the trade was enormous. Chinese payments sometimes fell into arrears, which in turn provoked Uyghur anger. The result was a relationship marked by mutual dependence and mutual resentment. The Uyghurs had another way of extracting wealth from China: embassies. These missions, formally presented as tribute delegations, were in reality also commercial and political opportunities. In less than a century, more than 100 such embassies were sent to the Chinese court. Some were enormous, numbering over 1,000 participants, and including the wives of important dignitaries. Membership in these missions must have been highly desirable, for they offered access to gifts, luxury goods, trade, and the spectacle of imperial magnificence. Yet this too had an unintended effect. Rather than satisfying elite appetites, repeated exposure to Chinese wealth only sharpened them. The Uyghur ruling class, along with the Sogdians who often accompanied them, developed an ever greater taste for imported luxuries. The Khagan's ability to supply such goods remained essential to maintaining loyalty on the steppe. After the fall of Bogu, Tun Bagha Tarkan ruled under a new title and tried to repair relations with China. His task was not easy. The reigning emperor harboured deep hostility toward the Uyghurs, shaped by earlier humiliations. Still, diplomacy gradually succeeded, and a new Chinese princess was married into the Uyghur ruling house. This reflected a hard political reality. Despite imperial dislike, Chinese rulers still needed Uyghur support, especially in their continuing conflict with Tibet. The next period, however, was unstable. Several rulers were murdered and succession became uncertain. It was in this environment that a new office rose in importance, one described in Chinese sources as a Grand Minister or Grand General. Under one youthful Khagan, real power seems to have rested in the hands of this great dignitary, rather than the ruler himself. Eventually, that powerful minister took the throne, marking the end of the original ruling house that had led the Uyghur rise to empire. A new clan replaced the old Yaglakar dynasty. This transfer of power did not immediately weaken the state, and the early 9th century still saw notable political and cultural achievements. During one reign, the great trilingual inscription of Karabalgasun was erected in Chinese, Uyghur, and Sogdian, a striking symbol of the cultural complexity of the Uyghur Empire. It also reflects a renewed prominence of both Sogdian and Manichaean influence. Chinese distrust of that influence remained strong. At one point, the Uyghur ruler requested a Chinese imperial bride and met resistance not simply because of cost, but because the Chinese court remained wary of the political world that surrounded the Khagan. Eventually the marriage was arranged, but only after delay and diplomatic strain. In the final phase of the empire, weakness became increasingly visible. One ruler was murdered by his own entourage. Another later committed suicide while facing both external danger and internal conspiracy. Natural disaster made matters even worse. Exceptionally severe snowfall caused famine and deepened the sense of crisis. At the same time, the Kyrgyz, long hostile to the Uyghurs, were gaining strength. Their struggle with the Uyghurs had lasted for years, and now they found their chance. In 840, with the support of a renegade Uyghur commander, they struck at Karabalgasun and destroyed the capital. This was the decisive blow. The Uyghur Empire in Mongolia collapsed, though the final clearing of resistance took longer. Rival Uyghur groups sought Chinese assistance, but China's interest was limited. Once the Chinese princess, still among the Uyghurs, had been recovered, the court showed little desire to rescue its fallen ally. On the contrary, some Chinese statesmen argued that the time had come to destroy the remaining Uyghur forces completely. The alliance that had once sustained the Tang in its darkest hour ended without sentiment. The people who overthrew the Uyghurs, the Kyrgyz, belonged to a very different world. Their language was Turkic and close enough to that of the Turks and Uyghurs, yet their physical descriptions in Chinese and Persian sources set them apart. They are portrayed as tall, strong, often fair-haired and light-eyed, and unlike the Turks and Uyghurs, they were not usually linked by Chinese writers to the Xiongnu. Their earlier history reaches far back into the steppe and forest zone of Inner Asia. Ancient references place their ancestors much farther west than their later homeland, suggesting a long eastward movement over time. By the early medieval period, they occupied the Yenisei region, a harsher environment than the classic Mongolian steppe. Their way of life reflected that landscape. The Kyrgyz were not a typical open steppe nomadic power. They were a forest people as much as a pastoral one. Their land was marked by immense pine forests, marshy summers, and brutal winters with deep snow. In cold seasons they lived in bark-covered huts, and they hunted on skis across frozen terrain. Their tribute to China consisted not of steppe products alone, but of pelts. They practiced tattooing and followed shamanic religion. Their shamans were known by the same Turkic terms found elsewhere in Inner Asia, but their customs were unusual in several respects. Chinese observers noted, for example, that they did not follow the common steppe practice of cutting the face in mourning. Their ruler's original title also differed from the better-known Khagan title, which they adopted only after defeating the Uyghurs. The Kyrgyz were also skilled metalworkers. Their land contained gold, tin, and iron, and they were known for making fine weapons. Archaeological evidence supports the written reports of their military craftsmanship. Their armour, horse equipment, and pointed helmets indicate a strong martial tradition. Yet despite their military success, the Kyrgyz did not replace the Uyghurs as a true imperial force in Mongolia. Their power base remained in the Yenisei region. For demographic and economic reasons, they could not fully occupy the political space the Uyghurs had once controlled. Their domination of Mongolia was more nominal than deeply rooted, and it lasted only about a century. By the early 10th century, a new power had begun to dominate the lands that had once formed the center of the Uyghur Empire. This was the Khitan. By around 924, they exercised effective control over Mongolia. One sign of this shift comes from an offer made by a Khitan ruler to the Uyghurs of Kanchu, inviting them to return to their former homeland. They declined. By then, they were already settled elsewhere and had no desire to reoccupy the old imperial center. That refusal says much about how completely the political world of Inner Asia had changed. With the arrival of the Khitan and the retreat of the Kyrgyz from Mongolia, the long period of Turkic dominance in that central zone came to an end. The Uyghur Empire had vanished, but its memory, its cities, its religious transformations, and its role in linking the steppe to China and Central Asia left a lasting mark on the history of Eurasia. After the collapse of the Uyghur Empire in the mid-9th century, its people did not disappear. Instead, they scattered across Central Asia, carrying their traditions into new lands and reshaping them in the process. One branch moved toward the Gansu corridor, where they founded a small kingdom that would endure for generations before eventually falling to rising regional powers. Their descendants still survive today as a distinct community in that region. Another, larger movement pushed further west, crossing the lands north of the Tian Shan Mountains before descending into the fertile basin of Turfan. There, around the middle of the 9th century, they established a new and enduring state, known as the Kingdom of Kocho. This new homeland was no random refuge. The Turfan region had long been a vital crossroads between east and west, a key point along the great trade routes that connected China with Central Asia and beyond. Surrounded by mountains, fed by snowmelt streams, and sustained through ingenious underground irrigation systems, it offered something the steppe never could: stability. Agriculture flourished in this oasis environment. Fields produced grain, cotton, fruits, and vegetables, while nearby pastures supported large herds of livestock. The region's natural wealth and strategic location made it one of the most valuable territories in Inner Asia. Long before the arrival of the Uyghurs, Turfan and the surrounding areas had already developed a complex cultural landscape. Earlier inhabitants spoke Indo-European languages and had built prosperous city-states, such as Karasha and Kucha. These centres were known for their agriculture, trade, and especially their cultural life, which included strong artistic and religious traditions. Chinese influence had also been present for centuries, bringing with it literature, administrative practices, and education. By the time the Uyghurs arrived, the region was already a meeting place of civilizations. The arrival of the Uyghurs transformed this world. They did not simply conquer and replace the existing population. Instead, a gradual blending began. Through intermarriage and daily interaction, different peoples merged into a new cultural and social structure. Because the Uyghurs held political power and arrived in large numbers, their language eventually became dominant, replacing older local languages and serving as a common means of communication across the region. Yet this was not a one-sided process. The earlier inhabitants left a deep mark on Uyghur society, shaping its culture, beliefs, and even its language. Over time, the Uyghurs themselves underwent a profound transformation. The nomadic traditions of the steppe began to fade as they adopted a settled way of life. Cities expanded, agriculture became central to the economy, and a more complex social structure emerged. In Kocho, a distinctive civilization took shape, combining elements from Turkic, Chinese, Iranian, and local traditions. It was a world far removed from the mobile camps of their ancestors, yet it still retained echoes of that earlier heritage. The political system of Kocho reflected this new reality. The ruler, bore the title edict, a term that conveyed both authority and sacred legitimacy. Beneath him stood a hierarchy of officials ranging from high-ranking ministers to local administrators. Society itself was layered, including nobles, officials, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Land ownership played a key role in rural life, with large estates supported by tenant farmers and labourers. Even remnants of older systems of dependency survived, showing that the transition from steppe to settled life was gradual and complex. Kocho maintained active relations with its neighbours. To the east, it engaged in regular diplomatic and commercial exchanges with Chinese dynasties. To the west, however, relations were more tense. Another Turkic power, the Karakhanids, had embraced Islam, while the Uyghurs of Kocho largely followed Buddhism. This religious divide created deep hostility, despite their shared language and origins. For centuries, the Uyghurs resisted the spread of Islam into their territory, preserving their own cultural and religious identity. In the early 13th century, a new force appeared on the horizon. The Mongol leader, Genghis Khan, was expanding his power across the steppe. Unlike many other states, the Uyghurs chose submission over resistance. Their ruler accepted Mongol authority, and in return, Kocho was treated with relative favour. Its borders remained intact, and its people were integrated into the growing Mongol world. This decision allowed the Uyghurs to preserve their society for a time, but it could not protect them forever. Internal conflicts and wider instability eventually weakened the kingdom. Prolonged struggles in Central Asia disrupted trade and strained resources. By the late 13th century, Kocho had lost its independence and was absorbed into a larger imperial system. What had once been a thriving centre of culture and commerce became just one region within a vast empire. Despite its political decline, the cultural achievements of the Uyghur kingdom were remarkable. Kocho became a major centre of religious and intellectual life. Several belief systems coexisted there, including Manichaeism, Christianity, and above all, Buddhism. Over time, Buddhism became the dominant faith, deeply influencing daily life and artistic expression. Temples were built, sacred texts were copied, and religious festivals brought communities together. These activities were seen not only as acts of devotion, but also as ways to gain spiritual merit. Art flourished in this environment. Murals, sculptures, and manuscripts reveal a society rich in imagination and skill. The paintings show scenes of everyday life as well as religious themes, offering a vivid picture of how people lived, dressed, and interacted. The blending of artistic styles from different cultures created a unique visual tradition that reflected the diversity of the region. Literature and scholarship also reached high levels. Many religious texts were translated into the Uyghur language, making them accessible to a wider audience. The language itself developed into a flexible and expressive medium, used not only for religious works but also for administrative and everyday purposes. Writing became an essential part of urban life, supporting trade, governance, and education. This cultural richness was not limited to religion. The Uyghurs absorbed influences from many directions, combining them into a distinctive synthesis. Elements from Chinese, Iranian, and Central Asian traditions merged with their own heritage, creating a society that was both diverse and unified. This blending of cultures became one of the defining features of the Uyghur world. While the Uyghur kingdom of Kocho was developing in Central Asia, another power was rising further east. The Tangut state. Formed by a people of Tibeto-Burman origin, this state emerged in the region of the Ordos and gradually expanded into a significant regional power. Its rulers adopted many elements of Chinese political organization, while also preserving their own identity. Over time, they built a structured government, established a capital, and created administrative institutions that allowed them to manage a large and diverse territory. The Tangut state developed a complex economy based on agriculture, livestock, and trade. Its lands included fertile river valleys, as well as wide pastures, supporting both farming and herding. The state was largely self-sufficient and even exported valuable goods, such as animals and salt. Its rulers also undertook major reforms, including the creation of a unique writing system and the translation of important religious texts into their own language. Culturally, the Tangut world reflected a balance between different influences. Buddhism played a major role, but Chinese philosophical traditions were also adopted, especially in government and administration. This combination allowed the Tangut state to develop its own path, neither fully Chinese nor entirely separate from the broader cultural world of East Asia. However, like the Uyghur kingdom, the Tangut state eventually faced the overwhelming force of the Mongol expansion. Despite periods of resistance and negotiation, it could not withstand the sustained pressure. In the early 13th century, Mongol armies launched a series of devastating campaigns. The final assault ended with the complete destruction of the Tangut state. Its cities were ruined, its population suffered immense losses, and its cultural achievements were largely wiped away. In the aftermath, the region was absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Over time, new populations settled there, and new cultural identities formed. The legacy of the Tangut people gradually faded, but traces of their civilization survived in scattered texts, ruins, and historical memory. High in the western Himalayas lies a rugged world often called the Trans-Himalayan region, a land set just south of the great ranges that stretch towards Central Asia. Protected by towering mountains, this landscape stands apart from the rhythms of the monsoon and is shielded from the harsh northern storms. The Indus River cuts across the region, yet it does not unite it. Its deep, rocky channel and steep banks make navigation and settlement difficult. Instead, the land is divided by mountains into isolated valleys, each forming its own small community. Over time, these communities developed into separate cultural zones and small political units, which is why this area has always been known as a collection of states, rather than a single unified realm. Situated to the southwest of Tibet, the region has never had a single shared historical name. Scholars in later centuries attempted to label it, but no term fully captured its diversity. Even modern political designations reflect only fragments of this complex geography. The early medieval history of this region begins with the rise of ruling families of Turkic origin, though their exact beginnings remain uncertain. These groups appear to have replaced older dynasties that had once controlled key valleys such as Gilgit. Around the 8th century, the region became a contested frontier. Tibetan forces advanced into the area through the high passes, while Chinese military expeditions attempted to counter them and restore earlier rulers. These shifting powers left behind only fragments of historical memory. Some rulers claimed divine ancestry, linking themselves to solar deities, while others were described by outside observers as belonging to Turkic tribes. These scattered accounts suggest a period of transition, where older political traditions gave way to new ruling elites arriving from the north. Among the most prominent of these ruling lines was a dynasty remembered in local tradition as the Trakans. Their origins are wrapped in legend, blending Persian royal imagery with local narratives. Stories tell of a prince fleeing westward upheavals, marrying into a local royal family, and founding a new line of rulers. Whether myth or memory, such tales reflect the merging of cultures that defined the region. Over generations, rulers rose and fell in quick succession, shaping a political landscape that was constantly shifting. By the end of the 10th century, northern influences had become firmly embedded in the ruling houses, reinforced by marriages and alliances with neighbouring regions. Power struggles within these dynasties were frequent. Rival branches competed for control, sometimes fleeing across glaciers into neighbouring valleys or seeking support from distant allies. In some cases, external rulers intervened, installing new leaders and altering the balance of power. These events also brought religious change. New beliefs entered the region through political alliances and invasions, though their spread was uneven and often contested. Despite these disruptions, local rulers demonstrated resilience, defending their territories and maintaining their authority against repeated challenges. The wider region was never isolated from the currents of Central and South Asian history. Mongol incursions, shifting powers in Kashmir, and developments in nearby trade routes all left their mark. Rulers maintained close ties with neighbouring states, encouraging trade and cultural exchange. Craftsmen and artisans were brought from other regions, transforming local architecture and artistic traditions. Fortresses rose above valleys, serving as both defensive structures and symbols of authority. Marriages between ruling families further strengthened connections across the mountains, linking distant valleys into a loose network of alliances. Distinct ruling families also emerged in neighbouring areas such as Hunza, Naga, and Chitral, each with its own traditions and origin stories. Some accounts describe the founding of these states through legendary figures, emphasizing the dramatic and often mythical nature of their beginnings. Rivalries between these states were constant, shaping the political landscape for centuries. Wars over land, power, and prestige became a defining feature of life in the region, with alliances shifting as quickly as the mountain weather. Baltistan developed along a somewhat different path, influenced strongly by Tibetan culture as well as by contacts with Kashmir and Central Asia. Its rulers traced their origins through a mix of local traditions and external influences. Over time, new populations arrived, bringing different cultural and political elements. Settlements expanded and new centres of power emerged, supported by agriculture and trade. The region's position along important mountain routes made it a crossroads of ideas, religions, and economic exchange. Relations with surrounding regions played a crucial role in shaping this world. While direct conflict with some neighbours was limited, cultural and commercial connections were constant. Craftsmen, religious figures, and traders moved across the mountains, carrying with them new ideas and practices. Spiritual movements, especially those associated with Sufi traditions, left a lasting impact on the religious life of the Almantika. These influences blended with older beliefs, creating a diverse and layered cultural identity. Over the long term, the region developed a complex social structure shaped by geography, migration, and political change. The ruling elites were often of Turkic origin, but they adopted local languages and customs. The broader population, however, remained rooted in older linguistic and cultural traditions, forming distinct communities with their own identities. In some areas, tribal systems replaced centralized authority, with local leaders governing through councils and collective decision-making. In others, established dynasties maintained hierarchical systems of rule. The economic life of the Almantika was shaped by its environment. Agriculture was limited by the terrain, relying heavily on irrigation systems that channeled glacier meltwater to terraced fields. Pastoralism also played an important role, with communities adapting to the challenges of high-altitude living. Scarcity of arable land often led to Sankersh, as communities competed for control of valuable Alaradi. These pressures contributed to long-standing rivalries between neighbouring groups, some of which became deeply embedded in local traditions. Today, every community across the northern areas follows Islam. Yet the faith did not arrive here through a single movement or from one clear direction. Its spread was slow, uneven, and shaped by many routes of contact coming from the north, the south, and the west. Because of that long process, Islamic life in the region never developed in exactly the same form everywhere. Belief, ritual, and social habit vary from valley to valley, and beneath these Islamic identities, older layers of culture still remain visible. Ancient habits survived in local memory, in the reverence shown to unusual rocks and high peaks, in stories about unseen beings believed to dwell in the landscape, and in the awe inspired by glaciers and the destructive force they could unleash. Older traditions also continued in animal sacrifice, seasonal ceremonies, communal dances, burial customs, clothing styles, ornaments, household tools, and patterns of everyday work. These elements were not isolated details. They were woven into a way of life based on orchards, herding, and mountain agriculture, and each sub-region preserved them in its own distinct form. In the modern period, the Muslim population of this broad mountain zone came to include several major traditions. Some communities followed Sunni Islam, others adopted Ismaili teachings, others became Twelver Shiite. And in Baltistan, the Nurbakhshi Sufi path also took deep root. The spread of these traditions did not happen all at once. The arrival of Ismaili influence is difficult to date, with certainty in the earlier centuries, but the impact of missionaries and wandering religious teachers became increasingly important over time. Disciples connected with the spiritual world of Kashmir entered the area during the late medieval period and helped lay the foundation for later change. In Baltistan, the religious landscape was especially shaped by preachers and holy families whose tombs remained places of memory long after their deaths. Some came through Kashmir, others by way of Yarkand and Persian lands, and their efforts helped establish Shiite beliefs in several valleys. From Baltistan, missionary activity continued toward Gilgit and surrounding districts, where more shrines marked the path of religious expansion. In this way, Islam in the northern areas was never simply imported and imposed. It took shape through local adaptation, long-distance connections, and the gradual influence of revered figures whose presence remained tied to the land. The story of the Khitan unfolded in a very different setting, and it does not fit neatly into the ordinary framework of a single nation tied to one stable territory. Their history is the story of a people who preserved a sense of identity across many centuries, while moving from one homeland to another and undergoing striking cultural and linguistic change along the way. Before the 5th century, they were known under other names and belonged to a broader cluster of peoples, described in Chinese records as part of the eastern frontier world. The first clear mention of the Khitan under their own name appears in the early 5th century, when they suffered a defeat at the hands of the Northern Wei. At that time, they lived along the upper Liao River, but pressure from war pushed them into new territory, farther south and east. Even this early conflict reflected the tangled relationships of Inner Asia, because the Northern Wei themselves were ruled by a non-Chinese dynasty that shared distant links with the same wider world from which the Khitan emerged. The Khitan occupied a region of varied landscapes. Their homeland included mountain slopes, open plains, forest zones, and riverlands, giving them access to more than one way of life. They raised horses in large numbers and also kept cattle and sheep. Some parts of their country supported farming, while the forests and waters of Manchuria allowed for hunting and fishing on a substantial scale. The land also contained mineral wealth, and this would become one of the most important advantages in Khitan history. Metalworking and mining helped support a more diversified economy than was usual in much of medieval Inner Asia. This economic flexibility gave the Khitan an unusual strength. They were not dependent on one single mode of production, and from an early stage their society brought together pastoral, agricultural, industrial, and hunting traditions in a single political sphere. From the beginning, the Khitan appear not as a single uniform people, but as a federation held together by shared interest more than by complete cultural unity. Their own origin story reflects this mixed character. One of their ancestral legends tells of a man riding a white horse along one river and a woman travelling in a cart drawn by a grey ox along another. They met where the two rivers joined, and from their union came the ancestors of the original Khitan tribes. In this tale, the rivers themselves seem almost to create the people, and the white horse and grey ox became sacred animals in later Khitan ritual life. The story points to a civilization made from different elements joined together at a frontier. Similar themes appear in the heroic traditions of other inner Asian peoples, where a nation's beginning is tied to a sacred landscape and symbolic animals. Chinese writers, often doubtful of such stories, also preserved fragments of legend about the earliest Khitan rulers. Some of these figures were described in strange and symbolic ways. One ruler was said to live in seclusion and appear only during sacred ceremonies, while another was imagined with the head of a boar and dressed in animal skin. These descriptions may preserve echoes of old religious ideas, totemic identities, or a division between sacred and practical authority. Another legendary ruler was remembered through a tale of miraculous abundance, as though royal power itself guaranteed renewal. Taken together, these traditions suggest that early Khitan rulership may have combined ritual kingship with a second, more active form of leadership in war and politics. Long before the Khitan built an empire, they had already developed a political culture in which symbolism, ceremony, and tribal power were closely linked. By the 8th century, the Khitan were appearing regularly in the turmoil of East Asian politics. They could be found sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, in the age of major rebellions and shifting frontiers. By the 9th century, their 8 main tribes were governed by a chief chosen from a leading family for a limited term. The office was not entirely secure. If disaster struck the community, the leader could be removed before his term ended. Over time, however, the balance of power changed. The old ruling family lost its hold, and in the late 9th century, a new figure rose to prominence. This was Abaoji of the Yelu clan, the man who would transform the Khitan from a confederation into an empire. Abaoji was first elected in the traditional way, but he was not willing to surrender power when his term was over. Backed by growing support, he established an independent base centered on a settlement known for its large Chinese population. This place offered both fertile farmland and valuable resources such as iron, copper, gold, and salt. His family already understood the importance of economic development. Metalworking had been expanded by combining the skills of local specialists with those of Chinese settlers, and control over a crucial salt lake further strengthened their position. With these resources, Abaoji built a power base unlike that of earlier tribal chiefs. Wealth drew followers and violence removed rivals. After securing his position, he proclaimed himself emperor and adopted a Chinese imperial title. In doing so, he founded a dynasty that would later be known as the Liao. The Khitan state that Abaoji created was both inner Asian and imperial in style. Its ruler still underwent a traditional enthronement, marked by symbolic ordeal, horseback ritual, and the use of felt, but this political culture now stood at the center of a large and expanding empire. Stories about Abaoji's own birth cast him as a man marked by destiny from the beginning, touched by heavenly signs and displaying uncanny maturity as an infant. Such tales placed him in the long tradition of heroic founders, whose greatness is announced before they can even speak. At the same time, his real achievements were practical and political. He treated allied tribes with care, distributed reward and punishment in ways that seemed fair and strengthened the resources of both state and people. Herds multiplied, supplies increased, and his authority became secure. Relations with China remained central to Khitan history. Contacts between the Khitan and Chinese courts stretched back centuries, but the collapse of the Tang dynasty opened new opportunities. As China fell into division, the Khitan became more important than ever. Chinese rulers sent envoys to them, and Chinese states sometimes relied on Khitan military support. In return, the Khitan gained territory deep inside northern China, including regions that would later make Beijing one of their capitals. Once the Song dynasty arose in the south, Khitan expansion met a stronger barrier, and a long peace eventually emerged based on rough equality between the two empires. The details of Liao rule over northern China belong to a much broader story, but what matters here is that the Khitan had become a major imperial force, no longer a frontier people living in the shadow of others. Their relations with the great nomadic powers of Mongolia were equally complex. At different times they fought with the Rouran, clashed with Korean forces, interacted with the Turks, and later became connected with the Uyghurs. Sometimes they submitted, sometimes they resisted, and sometimes they cooperated. Even after the fall of older steppe empires, memories of these relationships remained. Hostility with Turkic groups continued in some directions, while ties with the Uyghurs were often friendlier and more layered. Several important clans within the Khitan elite had Uyghur roots, including groups closely linked to the imperial family through marriage. Women from these elite lines held considerable power. Empresses appeared at public ceremonies, joined imperial hunts, influenced policy, and in some cases openly reshaped tradition. One imperial widow even refused to follow her husband into death, ending an old custom through sheer force of will. One famous episode from the early 10th century shows both the closeness and the tension in Khitan-Uyghur relations. Uyghur envoys arrived at the Khitan court, and the event later became linked with the creation of one of the Khitan writing systems. The Khitan eventually produced two scripts of their own, neither fully understood today, both modelled in outward appearance on Chinese forms but structurally different. Uyghur influence, however, went beyond diplomacy. It touched agriculture, court life, and cultural exchange. The Khitan learned certain refined agricultural techniques from Uyghur communities, including methods used in melon cultivation. Yet for all the cordiality between them, the Khitan kept a certain distance and guarded their own imperial prestige carefully. The rise of Khitan power also drew the attention of the Islamic world. Embassies from Persian and Arab lands reached the Khitan court in the early 10th century, showing that the empire was already known far beyond East Asia. A century later, the Khitan sent a mission westward toward the court of Mahmud of Ghazna. This mission seems to have been prompted by the growing reach of Ghaznavid conquest. The Khitan wanted information, perhaps contact, and perhaps a measure of diplomatic recognition. Their letter spoke with the confidence of a ruler who considered himself superior to all powers under heaven. Mahmud, however, responded coldly. He dismissed the idea of close relations and made it clear that distance, religious difference, and mutual caution would define the relationship. His reply was harsh, but it also recognized a basic truth. A direct clash between the Ghaznavids and the Liao was unlikely, and diplomacy alone could not bridge the great cultural and geographic divide between them. The fall of the Liao did not come because of distant Western powers, or because peace with the Song collapsed overnight. The true danger arose closer to home. In Manchuria, the Jurchen, long subject to the Khitan, rose in revolt and built a new state of their own. Under strong leadership, they pushed south and west, conquering much of northern China and destroying Liao power. The Khitan did not vanish, but their rule in China came to an end. Some were absorbed into the new order, while others looked elsewhere for survival. Out of this crisis emerged one of the most remarkable second acts in Inner Asian history. The architect of that second act was Yelu Dashi, a descendant of the old imperial line. He was highly educated, militarily gifted, and fully aware that the old Liao state could not be saved by conventional means. Faced with the combined pressure of enemies and the weakness of his own ruler, he chose not to perish with the collapsing dynasty. Instead, he gathered a small but determined following and set out to build a new power in the West. His early force was not large, but he possessed extraordinary resolve and the ability to persuade others to trust his vision. He moved first toward the steppe, gained support from tribal groups, and called on leaders to join him in the name of restoring past greatness. Whether he truly intended to recover China or had already set his sights on a new empire farther west remains uncertain. What is clear is that he soon turned decisively toward Central Asia. Before leaving the Eastern world behind, he carried out traditional Khitan rites, including the sacrifice of the white horse and grey ox, preserving the symbols of his people's ancient identity. He then sought passage through the kingdom of Kocho, reminding the Uyghurs of old bonds between their peoples. Permission was granted, gifts were exchanged, and the westward movement continued. During this migration, the Khitan gradually came to be known in Muslim lands as the Kara Khitai, the Black Khitai. The change in name likely reflected the way Western peoples heard and pronounced the word through Uyghur mediation. The added term black probably carried an honorific or descriptive force, common in Inner Asian naming traditions, rather than a simple reference to colour. By the time Yelu Dashi reached the political world of Central Asia, conditions were favourable for intervention. The Karakhanid realm was divided and unstable, split between eastern and western branches and troubled by internal conflict. The first encounters between the advancing Khitai and the eastern Karakhanids were not uniformly successful. There were setbacks and defeats, and the surviving sources do not always agree on the sequence of events. Yet Yelu Dashi persisted. Moving through steppe and frontier zones, he gradually secured allies and exploited the weakness of local powers. Eventually, internal conflict among the Karakhanids opened the door. A ruler unable to control his own subjects sought outside help, and that help arrived in the form of occupation. Yelu Dashi entered Balasagun and gained a capital almost without struggle. What had begun as the flight of a displaced prince was becoming the foundation of a new empire. From Balasagun, the Kara Khitai expanded westward. They defeated rival rulers, challenged the authority of powerful Muslim states, and eventually won a major victory on the Katwan steppe against a coalition led by Sultan Sanjar. That triumph brought much of Turkestan under their authority, though they did not govern every place directly. Local rulers often remained in office as vassals, acknowledging Kara Khitai supremacy while continuing their own administration. This system reflected both pragmatism and necessity. The Kara Khitai were a ruling minority spread over a wide and diverse land. They could dominate, tax, and intervene, but they could not transform the region in their own image. Their empire was unlike the earlier Liao state in China. In China, the Khitan had ruled over a largely homogeneous population with long traditions of imperial government. In Central Asia, they ruled over a patchwork of Turkic and Iranian-speaking peoples, Muslim urban centres, tribal confederations, and semi-autonomous local elites. The core Kara Khitai ruling group remained culturally distinct, preserving Khitan and Chinese administrative habits, while living amid a society shaped mainly by Islam. Their chancery used Chinese writing, and even their coinage reflected Chinese models. At the same time, they did not attempt to convert their subjects or erase local customs. Their rule was demanding in taxation, but relatively tolerant in matters of religion. This tolerance became one of the defining features of the Kara Khitai state. The ruling house was probably Buddhist, yet it did not force Buddhism upon its subjects. Muslim communities continued their own religious life, and Christian groups, especially the Nestorians, also flourished under their protection. In some regions, churches and Christian graveyards remained active, and Kashgar itself served as an important centre of Eastern Christianity. The Kara Khitai state showed that an empire could be powerful without demanding uniformity. In this sense, it anticipated the broader imperial style later seen under the Mongols, who also often preferred obedience and tribute over forced cultural assimilation. After Yelu Dashi's death, power passed first to his widow, who ruled as regent, and then to later members of the dynasty. Female political authority remained strong, continuing older Khitan traditions in which imperial women played major roles in state affairs. Military intervention in Transoxiana continued, as did the careful balancing of vassals, rivals, and tax collection. The Kara Khitai remained influential across Semirache and the lands beyond the Oxus, but their position was never entirely secure. Their military resources were limited compared to the vast populations they dominated, and their empire depended on maintaining a delicate equilibrium among local powers. That balance began to break under pressure from new movements in the east. As Chinggis Khan rose in Mongolia, defeated enemies fled westward, carrying instability with them. Among these refugees was Kushlug of the Naiman, who found asylum with the Kara Khitai, and even entered the ruling family through marriage. At first, he seemed like a useful ally, but the arrival of his followers disturbed the political order within the empire's core lands. Historians have often imagined the collapse of Kara Khitai power as the result of a single coordinated attack from east and west, but the reality was more gradual and more internal. The state was weakened from within as the Naiman refugees recovered their strength, seized the lands that had given them shelter, and opened the way for other powers to strip away the western provinces. Kushlug's rise to power did not resemble a grand invasion from outside, but rather a struggle from within, a decisive confrontation inside the ruling elite itself. His challenge unfolded like a forceful seizure of authority by an ambitious son-in-law against an aging ruler who could no longer hold firm control. There were clashes between their supporters, yet the outcome was not marked by the complete destruction of the old order. When Kushlug secured victory in 1211, he did not immediately replace the existing system with a new title or formal claim. The former ruler remained in place as a symbolic figure, allowed to live out his final years in relative peace, before dying quietly not long after. Observers travelling through the region decades later still describe the Naiman and the Kara Khitai as closely connected, suggesting that the transition of power had been gradual rather than violently transformative. Yet Kushlug's position was far from secure. The political world around him was shifting rapidly, and the shadow of a far greater power was already moving across the steppe. The Mongols, under the leadership of Chinggis Khan, had begun to reshape the balance of Inner Asia. Their commanders were active in nearby regions, gathering intelligence and watching developments closely. It is almost certain that news of Kushlug's rise reached them quickly. The revival of Naiman's strength, even in a new setting, was something that could not be ignored. Kushlug had already escaped confrontation more than once, but this time there would be no such opportunity. Preparations were made to remove him, and the Mongol response would be decisive. Kushlug's rule revealed its weaknesses almost immediately. Internally, his policies created division rather than unity. His treatment of religious communities, especially his hostility toward Muslim populations, alienated the majority of those he governed. Externally, he found himself trapped between powerful enemies. To the west stood the Khwarezm Shah, and to the east the Mongols were advancing with growing force. Even former allies began to turn away. The Uyghur ruler, who had once maintained friendly relations with earlier Kara Khitai leadership, chose a different path, abandoning Kuchlug and aligning with the Mongols. This shift signaled a broader change. Loyalty was now being recalculated in light of the new power rising from the east. The final collapse came quickly. A Mongol force advanced into the region, and local populations, already resentful of Kuchlug's rule, rose in opposition. In key cities, resistance formed from within rather than being imposed from outside. Kuchlug attempted to respond, but the situation had already slipped beyond his control. Forced to flee once again, he sought refuge in distant mountain regions. But this time, escape was no longer possible. He was captured and executed, bringing an abrupt end to his brief and troubled rule. Kuchlug was not a figure of enduring greatness. He lacked the authority and personal magnetism that had defined earlier rulers of the Kara Khitai. His claim to power was uncertain, and he failed to secure the loyalty of those he governed. It is tempting to imagine how events might have unfolded differently if the old ruling line had remained intact when the Mongols arrived. Members of that lineage would later serve within the Mongol system itself, demonstrating a remarkable ability to adapt and survive. Some became advisors, administrators, and governors under the new order, carrying with them traditions from earlier empires into the expanding Mongol world. Even after the fall of their state, the people connected with this legacy did not disappear. Instead, they spread across vast regions, maintaining fragments of their identity far from their original homeland. Traces of their presence appear in distant lands, preserved in names, traditions, and even in the memory of other cultures. Their influence extended far beyond the boundaries of their former empire, reaching into regions as distant as Eastern Europe. The name associated with them would endure for centuries, becoming one of the most widely recognized designations for China in the medieval world and beyond. This legacy alone reflects the lasting impact of their historical role. At the same time, another transformation was unfolding in the heart of the steppe. The lands of Mongolia, shaped by wide plains and mountain barriers, had long served as a meeting point between different worlds. Trade routes connected east and west, while the steppe itself formed a vast corridor stretching across Eurasia. In this environment, a distinct form of nomadic life had developed, adapted to the challenges of climate and terrain. By the late 12th century, the peoples of this region had reached a turning point. The society of the steppe was no longer defined solely by ancient clan ties. Over time, traditional kinship structures had weakened, replaced by new forms of organization based on shared economic and political interests. Groups divided, reformed, and combined in response to changing conditions. Smaller family units replaced older communal arrangements, reflecting the growing importance of private ownership, especially of livestock. Wealth became a key measure of status, and a clear division emerged between the elite and the ordinary population. Among the elite were those who held traditional titles associated with leadership, skill, and authority. Their influence grew as larger political groupings formed. At the same time, the majority of the population consisted of common herders, dependents, and followers tied to more powerful leaders. Some were bound by obligation rather than outright servitude, forming relationships that resembled loyalty and protection rather than simple domination. New forms of personal allegiance also appeared, where individuals chose to attach themselves to a leader in exchange for support and opportunity. These bonds would become crucial in the rise of future powers. Economic life also changed. Earlier systems based on collective ownership gradually gave way to smaller, more flexible units, better suited to private herding. Instead of moving in large clan groups, families and smaller communities began to migrate independently, managing their own animals and resources. This shift allowed for greater mobility, but also increased competition. At the same time, larger political structures began to form as stronger groups absorbed weaker ones, creating confederations that could dominate wider territories. In this environment of fragmentation and consolidation, numerous tribes competed for influence. Some formed powerful alliances, while others struggled to maintain independence. Among them were groups that would later play a decisive role in shaping history. The region around certain key rivers and mountain zones became especially important, serving as the core from which new leadership would emerge. These areas preserved strong traditions and produced figures capable of uniting scattered communities. One such figure rose from these conditions. Born into a world of instability, he faced hardship from an early age, including the loss of his father and the breakdown of his family's position. Yet these challenges shaped his determination. He learned to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined steppe life. Using both traditional bonds and new forms of loyalty, he gradually built a following. He forged alliances, secured victories, and attracted supporters from different groups. Early successes established his reputation. With the support of powerful allies, he defeated rival tribes and recovered what had been lost to his family. These victories were not only military achievements, but also political statements, demonstrating his ability to lead and to reward those who followed him. As his influence grew, more groups joined his cause, drawn by both necessity and ambition. The alliances that had once supported him eventually gave way to rivalry. Former partners became competitors, and the struggle for dominance intensified. Through a series of campaigns and confrontations, he overcame each challenge. By carefully balancing force and strategy, he defeated opposing coalitions and dismantled the power of rival leaders. Over time, the fragmented tribes of the steppe were brought under a single authority. His formal recognition as ruler marked a turning point. A gathering of leaders confirmed his position, symbolizing the emergence of a unified political structure where none had existed before. From that moment, he could act not merely as a tribal chief, but as the head of a larger entity that encompassed much of the steppe. Yet unity was not achieved overnight. Several powerful groups still resisted, and it took years of further Sangharsh to bring them into line. Once control was secured, attention turned to organization. A new administrative system was established, combining military efficiency with political oversight. The population was structured into units that could be mobilized quickly, and leadership positions were assigned to trusted followers and relatives. This system replaced older tribal divisions, creating a more centralized form of authority. Loyalty was no longer tied solely to lineage, but to service and ability. Law and order were also strengthened. A set of rules was introduced to regulate behavior across the expanding realm. These laws covered everything from military discipline to social conduct, providing a framework for governance that extended beyond individual tribes. They became a foundation for stability, ensuring that the new order could function effectively across a vast and diverse territory. Military organization played a crucial role in maintaining power. Forces were arranged in structured units, each with clearly defined leadership. A personal guard surrounded the ruler, composed of selected individuals who combined loyalty with skill. This group served not only as protection, but also as a training ground for future commanders. Discipline was strict, but rewards were significant, reinforcing the system of merit and allegiance that underpinned the entire structure. By the early 13th century, the transformation was complete. The once divided tribes of the steppe had been united into a powerful force stretching across a vast expanse of land. From the forests of the north to the edges of the desert in the south, and from mountain ranges in the west to distant eastern frontiers, a new political reality had taken shape. This was no longer a loose collection of nomadic groups, but a structured and expanding power capable of reshaping the history of Eurasia. Soon after securing his authority in Mongolia and building the political and military system that would support his rule, Chinggis Khan turned outward. At first, his expansion does not seem to have followed a fully fixed master plan aimed immediately at conquering the great settled civilizations beyond the steppe. The pattern of his campaigns suggests a different priority. Before striking deeply into the wealthy urban worlds beyond Mongolia, he moved first against neighbouring nomadic peoples, whose way of life resembled that of the Mongols, and whose incorporation would strengthen the foundation of his power. In this early phase, expansion meant the unification of the steppe under one commanding force. In 1207, the nomadic tribes living in the regions of the Selenga and the Yenisei were brought under his control. 2 years later, the Uyghurs were absorbed into his growing dominion without major resistance. These Uyghurs had once ruled a powerful empire in Mongolia itself, and later moved southwest into the oasis lands of the Tarim Basin after the fall of that earlier state. Their submission was significant, not only politically, but also administratively, because they possessed traditions of literacy and government that would later prove useful to the Mongol Empire. Chinggis Khan also launched campaigns against the Jin Empire in northern China in 1210 and again a few years later. Yet these expeditions do not necessarily suggest that China was already his immediate main target. They may have been intended more as demonstrations of power, warnings to a dangerous neighbour, and tests of Mongol military reach than as a final attempt at conquest. After these strikes, his attention returned once more to the steppe and to the remaining nomadic powers beyond Mongolia. The next stage of expansion carried Mongol authority across a vast belt of Inner Asia. Chinggis Khan subdued nearly all the nomadic Turkic peoples stretching westward toward the northeastern borders of Persia. By 1218, the Kara-Khitai realm in Transoxiana had fallen under his authority with little serious resistance. As a result, East Turkestan and several other regions of Central Asia were drawn into the Mongol sphere. This changed the political map of the region completely. Mongolia was no longer separated from the major states of the Islamic world by buffers and intermediary powers. The Mongol dominion now stood face to face with one of the strongest empires of the age. That neighbouring state was the empire of the Khwarezm Shah, Ala al-Din Muhammad, who ruled over most of Transoxiana and northern Persia. By this time, Central Asia had been divided in effect into two great political zones. The eastern lands were under Mongol control, while the western lands were dominated by the Khwarezmian dynasty. Rivalry between these two expanding powers was not absolutely unavoidable, but it became increasingly likely. Chinggis Khan is said to have expressed a desire for peace and commercial exchange, presenting himself as master of the East while acknowledging the Khwarezm Shah as ruler of the West. Yet even this language carried an edge of superiority. He addressed the Khwarezm Shah not as a full equal, but in a manner that implied hierarchy. No direct evidence survives to reveal his deepest intentions, but whatever his original calculations may have been, the balance soon tipped toward war. Between 1219 and 1224, Chinggis Khan launched the campaigns that shattered the Khwarezmian Empire. At the time, that empire was already weakened by internal tensions, mistrust, and division. Mongol armies advanced with devastating force, and some of the greatest cities of Transoxiana and Khorasan suffered terrible destruction. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Otrar, Nishapur, Balkh, and Merv all faced the violence of conquest. These campaigns transformed the history of the northeastern Islamic world. Large Turkic populations, along with Persian-speaking urban societies, now fell under Mongol domination. The victory was not merely territorial. It brought the steppe empire into direct control over some of the richest and most urbanized lands in Eurasia. The campaign did not stop there. In pursuit of the defeated Khwarezm Shah, two of Chinggis Khan's most celebrated generals, Jebi and Subadeh, pushed far beyond Central Asia. In 1221, they entered the Caucasus, defeated the Georgian king, and rode onward onto the southern Russian steppe. In the spring of 1223, at the river Kalka, the Mongols crushed a combined force of Rus and Kipchak warriors. Yet this victory did not lead immediately to a full occupation of the region. After demonstrating their superiority, the commanders turned back, and by the end of that year they had rejoined the main Mongol forces. Chinggis Khan himself returned to Mongolia in 1225. His final campaign targeted the Tangut state, which was subdued in 1227. Soon after, he fell ill and died the same year. His body was carried back to the homeland and buried in the Khintai Mountains, in the landscape that had shaped his rise. It is possible that in the beginning Chinggis Khan did not possess a fully articulated theory of world conquest. Still, when his campaigns are viewed as a whole, they reveal a logic far greater than mere improvisation. There seems to have been a broad strategic understanding behind his actions. Earlier, steppe rulers had often made the same mistake. They united the nomads, then invaded northern China, and in settling there, they left the steppe itself open to new challenges. This created a recurring cycle in which each new confederation rose in the vacuum left by the previous one. Chinggis Khan appears to have avoided this trap deliberately. He first unified Mongolia, then neutralized China without becoming absorbed by it, then returned to absorb the remaining Turco-Mongol peoples of the steppe. Only after securing this larger nomadic world did he strike against the great sedentary powers. In that sense, his campaigns can be seen as the work of a ruler, determined not only to conquer outward, but to preserve the strategic heartland from which his strength came. He remained, to the end of his life, a ruler shaped by nomadic values. Unlike many conquerors before him, he did not abandon the steppe mentality, or allow himself to be absorbed by the attractions of settled luxury. The empire he left behind was still, at its core, an empire of nomadic peoples centered on Mongolia. Yet he was far from hostile to the practical achievements of sedentary civilization. He recognized useful tools when he saw them. The Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian and used it in state administration. With the submission of the Uyghurs and the fall of the Kara Khitai, Chinggis Khan gained access to administrators, scribes, and political intermediaries who could bridge the world of the steppe and the worlds of China and Islam. These peoples carried techniques of government, literacy, and diplomacy into Mongol service. Muslim officials in particular rose to prominent roles under the Mongol Khan, especially in an atmosphere where trade was protected and religions were tolerated. The success of Chinggis Khan's conquests cannot be explained by one factor alone. His own genius was central. He was not only a brilliant field commander, but also a calculating politician who understood men, timing, and structure. His armies were built around fast, disciplined, light cavalry, riding hardy horses and using the bow with terrifying effect. At the same time, he was pragmatic. He adopted methods and technologies from others, whenever they gave him an advantage. Chinese and Muslim specialists contributed to Mongol siegecraft, engineering, and battlefield technique. During the Western campaigns, gunpowder, mining, and sapping were already being used in attacks on fortified cities. This willingness to combine steppe mobility with borrowed technical skill made the Mongol army more dangerous than earlier nomadic forces. What Chinggis Khan left behind at his death was extraordinary. Unlike the Empire of Alexander, which quickly fractured after its founder died, the Mongol Empire continued to function, expand, and adapt. It possessed both territorial scale and dynastic continuity. His successors, drawn from his own family, carried forward the imperial project. During their reigns, the Mongol Empire became the largest uninterrupted land empire the world had yet seen. It stretched from East Asia deep into Europe. Campaigns were launched into Southeast Asia and even against islands such as Java and Japan, though these overseas ventures did not succeed. As a total imperial structure, Mongol rule endured well over a century, and some of its successor states lasted much longer. Yet the heirs of Chinggis Khan, even while proclaiming loyalty to his memory, did not fully preserve his central principle. He had resisted surrendering the steppe to the seductions of sedentary empire. His successors increasingly moved in the opposite direction. Ogedei, Guyuk, and Monkey continued expanding into the great urbanized regions of Eurasia. Their ambitions were not confined to the nomadic belt. They pushed deeper into lands defined by cities, bureaucracy, and agriculture. This brought enormous gains, but it also created immense strain. The Mongol conquests caused upheaval, destruction, and grief on a tremendous scale. Entire populations suffered, cities were ruined, and memories of Mongol violence became lasting scars in the historical consciousness of conquered peoples. Yet Chinggis Khan was not simply a destroyer driven by blind cruelty or plunder for its own sake. When he ordered massacre, it was generally tied to political purpose, military necessity, or the consolidation of power. This does not lessen the suffering, but it helps explain the cold logic behind Mongol warfare. The greatest challenge after conquest was no longer victory in battle, but the preservation of rule. Governing such an immense empire required structures unlike anything the Mongols had needed before. The early successors understood this and tried to build on what Chinggis Khan had already created. Even as the empire expanded, Mongolia remained, at least for a time, its symbolic and political center. But holding the center in the steppe became increasingly difficult once Persia and China had been conquered. The rulers now faced a problem no earlier nomadic empire had truly solved: how to reconcile the logic of mobile, pastoral rule with the demands of governing vast sedentary civilizations. That contradiction would become one of the main reasons why the empire eventually weakened. Even so, the unity of the empire held for decades after Chinggis Khan's death. Members of the ruling family maintained supremacy across enormous distances and through multiple generations. Part of this success came from ideology. The Khans continued to rule under the ancient belief that heaven had granted them authority. The sacred lineage of the imperial clan remained a source of legitimacy. The ruling family also understood the value of psychological power. To rule conquered peoples, it was not enough to seize land. One had to seize obedience, belief, and submission. In this sense, controlling the spirit of a population mattered as much as occupying its cities. Their policy of religious tolerance should be understood partly in this light. The Mongols were not religious fanatics. They allowed many beliefs to coexist under their rule, not only because steppe traditions had little taste for doctrinal persecution, but because tolerance was politically useful in an empire of many peoples and faiths. Earlier, inner Asian powers such as the Uyghurs and Khitan had already lived among diverse religions, and the Mongols inherited this flexible approach. The empire also relied on inherited and adapted steppe institutions. One of the most important was the Kurultai, the assembly of princes and nobles. In the Mongol imperial age, this old nomadic council became more significant than ever. It served as the place where great khans were formally proclaimed and where major decisions of war, law, and state policy were debated. Though the empire was dynastic, the authority of the ruler still required recognition through the traditions of the steppe elite. The Kurultai gave imperial rule a political ritual that connected new power to old legitimacy. The army remained the backbone of the empire. Its decimal organization continued under the successors of Chinggis Khan and became the model for armies across the Mongol world. New elements were added as the empire grew. Among the most important was the Tama force, a military formation used to secure and supervise conquered territories. These units were instruments of occupation and control, and in some regions they later developed into the permanent military foundations of major successor states. In this way, conquest armies became garrison systems, and steppe warfare was transformed into imperial administration. Control also depended on movement and communication. One of the most striking achievements of the Mongols was the creation of a vast transcontinental relay network. Under Ogedei especially, post stations were established across the empire so that official envoys, orders, and intelligence could move with astonishing speed. These stations supplied fresh horses, provisions, and support to authorized messengers. For the first time, a communication system connected the breadth of Inner Asia on a truly imperial scale. It facilitated not only government, but also trade, travel, and the circulation of ideas. This network deeply impressed later foreign visitors because it allowed an empire of enormous distances to function with remarkable cohesion. As the Mongols settled into rule over Persia, Russia, Central Asia, and China, they developed offices that helped them manage local affairs. One of the most important was that of the Darugachi, the imperial overseer placed in conquered territories. This office existed across many regions of the empire. At first, the role had a military character, but over time it became increasingly civil and administrative. The Darugachi supervised local populations, maintained order, and above all ensured the collection of tribute and taxes. Since there were never enough Mongols to fill every post, the Khans often relied on other groups, including Central Asians, Uyghurs, Persians, and even Western peoples, to help staff the bureaucracy. This not only strengthened Mongol rule, but also gave many non-Mongol elites a place within the imperial system. Taxation itself became highly developed. Earlier, Mongol demands had been based largely on tribute and levy paid in animals or goods. As the empire expanded into sedentary lands, taxation grew more complex and adapted to local societies. What had once been tribute from herding communities now became poll taxes, assessed obligations, and layered forms of revenue drawn from urban and agricultural populations. The Mongols were not simply raiders living off plunder. They became rulers of taxpayers, and this required systems, record-keeping, and regular enforcement. For a time, the policy of keeping Mongolia at the center gave the homeland new vitality. The country became a place where peoples, religions, languages, and skills from across Eurasia converged. Karakorum, the imperial capital, turned into a cosmopolitan city. Artisans captured in war built and adorned it. Merchants, clerics, envoys, and officials from many lands moved through its streets. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others coexisted there. Uyghurs, Persians, and other Central Asian Muslims held important posts in the empire's bureaucracy and played roles just as essential as battlefield commanders. Trade between East and West passed through Mongolia under imperial protection, helped greatly by the communications network and by the Mongol preference for open exchange. Muslim merchants were especially active in commerce, finance, and tax farming, becoming major figures in the new imperial economy. This phase, however, did not last unchanged. After the death of Mongke Khan in 1259, disputes broke out within the ruling family itself. Rival claimants from the Toluid branch each organized their own assemblies and each declared himself Khan. One of them represented a more traditional vision centered on Mongolia. The other, Kubilai, moved in a different direction. Their conflict led to civil war, and although Kubilai emerged victorious, the result marked a turning point. The old unity of the empire weakened, and rival centers of power gained greater independence. Even when the great Khan still claimed universal authority, the empire in practice was no longer fully governed from a single center. Under Kubilai, the transformation became unmistakable. He moved the imperial capital from Karakoram to northern China and adopted a dynastic title in Chinese style. This was not a minor administrative shift. It represented a fundamental change in the meaning of Mongol rule. In theory, Kubilai still stood as ruler of the whole empire. In practice, his position increasingly resembled that of a Mongol emperor of China rather than an unquestioned sovereign over all Mongol dominions. He did not forget his steppe origins, and he worked to preserve the Mongols as a privileged ruling elite within China. But the act of ruling from China altered the empire's character permanently. The center of gravity moved away from Mongolia. Karakoram lost its unique centrality, while Khan Balik rose as the